I've had some weird stuff happen lately, and it reminded me of a strange encounter that happened about 5 years ago. It was spring here in Utah, meaning cold mornings that require a coat and usually scraping your windows before leaving. I lived in a relatively remote community west of the railroad tracks that lead to oil refineries in my area. Not exactly a busy area, and very little housing where I lived in at the time, although now it's a bustling community. One Friday morning about 9:30, as I am on my way to work, my usual route is blocked due to an accident being cleared up, so I take the quieter route through the industrial park east of my house. I passed the only gas station on my way and headed through the industrial park, which is quiet except for diesel trucks and the rare car like my own. As I come over a small hill and over a set of train tracks, I see a car pulled over to the side with its hood up, and a guy just standing there next to the driver's side door looking at me as I approach the hill. The car was a copper-colored, two-door sports car from the late 70s or early 80s, Nissan I think. He looked straight out of the 70s, I'll never forget this guy. Blue jeans, white collar shirt showing above his coat, tan work boots, darkish tan, 70s style leather coat, with wool showing at the collar, a thick dark moustache, and a John Travolta in Saturday Night Fever-esque haircut. Bigger guy, probably in his mid-40s, around 6 feet tall or just over. Bit of a gut, but clearly a thick dude who wasn't in bad shape. Hands in pockets, but his feet planted firmly and back straight like he was at a parade rest. As I see him, I slow down to see what the problem was and start to pull over and get behind his car, and he's staring at me the entire time. No nod of recognition or hand wave to signal me. No smile, just staring with his face perfectly flat, hands in pockets not moving. I get this super creepy vibe, and as I'm about to pull over, I pulled away and sped off instead. That's very unlike me. I stop to help people all the time, but this guy really gave me a bad feeling I couldn't shake. As I look in the rearview mirror, I see he's not moved, but just turned his head a bit to watch me go, and as I watch, he turns back to stare over the tracks for the next car to come along. I get to work and am feeling bad that I didn't help him out, but I tell my boss/close friend about the encounter, and he tells me he gets creeped out hearing about it, and I should be glad I trusted my gut instinct. I didn't think much more of it and get to work. On my way home, I take that road back home to see if his car was left there, just in case he had a real problem, and sure enough it was gone. Feeling relieved he had at least gotten his car taken care of, I felt less bad about not helping some stranded stranger because I got weirded out by his appearance and demeanor. I got home, got some sleep, and think nothing of it. I worked Saturdays at the time and always took the long way to work on Saturday since I didn't have to worry about traffic. Come 9:30 the next day, I'm heading the same way to work I took the day before, but because the industrial park is full of Monday to Friday type companies, it's always a ghost town on the weekend. When I came home the previous night, I drove for 15 minutes in that area. Really low speed limits, and it's a really long road, and did not see another car on the road there. Even the gas station closes its inside operations on Saturdays and evenings after 6. Nobody was even around the area during those hours. So I'm cresting the hill, and sure enough, the same guy is there again. Same car, same spot, hood up, and standing next to the driver's side door. If I hadn't have been so creeped out by the guy the day before, I may not have noticed how eerily similar it was. Like he somehow hadn't moved since the day before. This time, however, he reacted to seeing me, pulling a hand out of his pocket and trying to wave me down. Without moving his feet and clearly yelling something, I speed up. He clearly heard my tin can of a Toyota rev up, and I kid you not, he put both hands up and moved as if to step in front of my car to block me. His face never changed the whole time, just a blank stare and semi-frown slit of a mouth as he started to step in front of my car in the 2-lane road I was on. I swerved a little to avoid hitting him and kept going. Now, here's the thing. That section of the road is straight for quite a way, and though I was really shaken up by the encounter, I looked in my mirror to see him just step back into his car and keep staring west, just like the day before, like a stranger hadn't just swerved to avoid killing him and leaving him to his own devices. It was weird. I never saw him again after that, but I called my local police force, of whom I know several officers personally, one of which was a neighbor, thinking maybe he really did have a problem. At the time, a few things stood out to me, namely that the day before at the gas station it would have been open, and if he didn't have a cell phone it was less than a block away, and he would have had to have passed it in order to be on that particular stretch of road. No way you couldn't have seen it and been where he was supposedly broken down. I hadn't thought of it Friday, but it struck me hard Saturday when I saw him again the second time, and everything was the same. Car with the hood up, outfit, even shirt as far as I could tell, place, and even the way he stood, just waiting for a car to come from the west just over the hill, where he had been hard to see in the way until you were fairly close. And since I knew his car hadn't been left overnight, that felt very, very wrong. Lastly, the dead look on his face when he tried to flag me down. I could see him clearly. I was going at 25 miles per hour, which is the speed limit on that particular spot, and he didn't change his expression when he saw me. He just went through the motions. That was probably the most unsettling part to me. It was like he knew what to do, but not how to do it right emotionally. Also, that he just turned back to staring immediately after I passed him. Like the day I asked one of my cop buddies if they came across the guy, but he hadn't heard anything. And even later on I came to find out that the cop on that route hadn't come across anyone when he stopped by a bit later. It's a smallish town, not that much happens, and non-emergencies are slow to be dealt with at best. My buddy told me thanks for calling. Stranded motorists can really get hosted when no one is around, but also good on me for following my instinct about the guy. Basically, if you feel creeped out by a stranded motorist, call the cops, and they'll find them help. Long story short, I never saw the guy again, and I hope I never do, because whatever his game was, I know his car wasn't just breaking down in the same convenient, hard-to-see spot repeatedly. All of the creepy stuff I've seen in my life, this is the one that comes to mind when I think of unsettling and unnerving run-ins. I worked at this hotel, and unexplainable stuff kept happening. There's one room in particular that has more activity than any others, and anyone who has worked there for longer than 2 months has a story to share about it. For some context, this room is not your typical hotel room. It's set up almost like an apartment. When you walk through the door, there's a common area where you can watch TV and have a meal, or enjoy the minibar complete with glassware. There are 2 bedrooms in this room, and they are separate from the common area. To start, the first story I'm going to tell you about happened to me. I was in the room cleaning by myself, in the 1 bedroom, when I hear the door to the room open up. I thought that the people staying in the room may have come back earlier than expected, so I called out from the bedroom apologizing about not having the room clean. However, I don't hear any response back, so I call out to them again and don't hear a response back. So I go out into the common area to see if someone was there. Then I looked into the other bedroom to see if they were there for some reason, but the room was empty. I was confused at this and finished cleaning the room before going to talk to my co-worker to see if he saw anyone come up to the room. When I asked him if he saw anyone go up to the room, he said he didn't. I asked if he was sure because I heard that door open with the card key click, and he said he didn't see anyone go up there in the room besides me. The next story is about the same room, but it happened to a co-worker. What he told me is that one night he was delivering drinks to another room, but the guy's a klutz, and ended up dropping the tray, shattering the glasses. Within 5 seconds of the glass breaking, he heard footsteps coming from the room, and then the door opened and closed. He thought it was just a guest, seeing where the noise had come from, and would explain the door opening and closing, so he brushed it off. After he got the broken glass all cleaned up, he made new drinks and delivered them, and then told my coworker what happened. He joked that he must have woken up the people in the nearby room because he heard the door open and then close. The coworker just looked at them confused and asked which room it was that he heard the door open. So he told them the room. Apparently there was no one staying in that room for the night, and both of them were worried that someone may have gotten in somehow. So they both went to the room to investigate, and when they went in, they found that no one was in there, but all the glassware in the cabinets was completely destroyed. To this day, I refuse to go into the room by myself unless strictly necessary, because it always sends a chill down my spine and has a weird vibe. The next story takes place in a different room of the hotel, and after the events of the first, just for context. On this particular day, we only had 2 people check in, and since the hotel is small, this occurrence happens every so often. As a result, I had to do a few extra tasks around the hotel, one of which is going into the empty rooms and turning off all the lights because people will leave the lights on more often than you'd think. So I went into every room and made sure all the lights were turned off, and went on to finish the rest of my tasks for the evening, because I could clock out, which is around 11 PM, but because it was a slow night I was able to finish my tasks 2 hours early. Normally, I will be allowed to clock out early, but the person running the shift that night was a stickler about clocking out early, so she made me double check all the rooms to make sure the lights were out, before she'd consider letting me clock out early. I checked every room, and as I expected, all the lights were turned off, except for this one that had all the lights on. I was shocked when I walked in, because I knew for a fact I had been in every room and turned all the lights off. So, the fact that it was turned on freaked me out. But as I was walking out, a light by the bed suddenly switched on. I was now creeped out. I hadn't heard of people seeing lights coming on in their room, so I knew something was up, and just left that room. The next story happens earlier this year, and is one that still creeps me out to this day. I was finishing cleaning this one room, and was going back to our supply room to grab stuff to clean it. As I was walking back to the room, I looked down the hall and saw a woman in a white robe and brown hair walk towards her room. I go in the room to check and see which room I have to clean next, and it just so happened that it was a room down the same hallway the woman was walking. I was mad because what this meant is the woman came back to her room earlier than expected, so I would have to go to her room and ask when I could clean her room. Now this may seem odd because it's a boutique hotel, but we try to be more personal and give that extra interaction with guests. I go to the room and knock on the door, expecting her to reply, but after 30 seconds didn't get a response. I waited for 2 minutes before I used my card key to enter in case something had happened to her, and as I opened the door slightly to call out her name to make sure it was okay to proceed, I don't get a reply. I then enter the room cautiously and look around to find no one. I immediately start to panic because I knew for a fact I saw someone walk this way to the end of the hall and that there were no other rooms she could have gotten into, and I just ran out the room and closed the door. I got to the front desk to speak to my coworker about what I saw, and he didn't seem fazed. Although he hadn't seen her himself, he says there are other people that have seen the Phantom Lady. The following story happened in the basement of the hotel, which alone looks very creepy and gives you a very unwelcoming vibe. The basement is the heart of the hotel though, because it's how we're able to transport items without any guests seeing, storing stuff as needed, and also has some offices. Employees have always just reported feeling uneasy walking through the halls, especially at night, because sometimes it feels like you're being watched. This incident happened on Thanksgiving night of 2018. I only remember because after I finished my tasks for the day, I had to help set up Christmas decorations. I go to the one storage area we call the dungeon, which got its name due to being dimly lit and having a really musty odor, to grab a few wreaths. I spot the box containing the wreaths and grab two. As I'm walking out, I hear a whisper in my ear as clear as day, "Wrong one." I immediately jump back, because I was the only one around and had no idea who or what could have made that noise, but I just went back to the main floor to set up the wreaths. Turns out, the one wreath that I bought couldn't be used due to lack of ribbon, tinsel, and there being no holly or berries on it. Within an instant, I knew that the voice was trying to tell me that I was bringing up the wrong wreath, and I was shocked that I was being helped out. The following story takes place in the basement too, although it didn't happen to me. The story goes that an employee was walking down the hall of a basement and saw what looked like one of the maintenance workers in the basement, but this was well past the time their shift ended. She called out to him asking why he was still there, when she suddenly heard a crashing noise coming from a storage room next to her. She goes to see what caused the noise, and there's a hole in the door like someone punched through it. She goes back out to talk to the guy, but he was gone. The next story happened to this one employee who was doing a turn-down service in a room. For those of you unfamiliar, turn-down service is when your room is refreshed, and you're given champagne and chocolate-covered strawberries. At least that's how we do it. However, we also add candles to the room, and have a live flame to it, which I think is stupid as I see it as a fire hazard. But the hotel hasn't burned down yet. The guy was finishing lighting the final candle and double-checked to make sure he didn't forget anything, and found he forgot to get them new body towels. He goes and grabs them the new towels, and when he comes back into the room, all of the candles he lit were out. Not one, but 8 of them. He thought this was weird, so he lit them again and was on his way. But just like me, he was interested in the unexplainable. So he waited another 5 minutes before going back into the room, and sure enough the candles were out. He lit them again and left because he was sure the ghost was messing with him. 2 hours later, the guests that had the turn-down service called to complain about the candles in the room being out when they arrived. Go figure. This last story is a bit more wholesome. For the first 15 years the hotel was open, all of the groundskeeping was managed by the guy called Sam. From what I've heard, Sam loved his job, because as he saw it, he was the artist of the hotel, and helped add to its beauty because he would make sure everything was perfect. Grass was even, flower beds looked stunning. In the winter he made sure the parking lot was always clear of ice and snow. Sam really took pride in his work, but sadly passed of a heart attack 8 years ago on the grounds. It just hasn't been the same since. However, some groundskeepers still think he hasn't moved on and still roams the place. One groundskeeper said he remembers one day, as he finished putting new flowers in the front, he suddenly heard a whisper say, "Beautiful." He looked around and saw no one other than groundskeepers nearby, but not near enough for them to have said this. Apparently this kind of stuff happens more often than you'd imagine. Multiple groundskeepers have said any time they put in a large amount of effort into making the grounds look beautiful, they'll sometimes hear a voice of someone saying that they did a good job. They believe it's Sam checking up with the grounds, because if there was any place he'd want to be, it's there, because of how much he cared for the hotel grounds. Just as a fun factoid, The land on which the hotel was built used to be farmland for around 170 years, until it was bought up and converted into use of the hotel in and around the 1990s. As far as the unexplained stuff at the hotel goes, he says that he never noticed anything until around 3 months of the hotel being open. He said it would be little things at first, like something falling off a desk or table, besides knowing for a fact they weren't very close to the edge. The activity became more intense as the years went on, and he thinks of the first time someone reported hearing a voice being in 2000. An employee was getting supplies in the service room when all of a sudden they heard a voice say, "Leave." The guy looked around to see if he was being told to hurry up, but couldn't find anyone. Activity started to get violent in 2004 when it was first reported that the bed in a room that had just been made was essentially trashed. None of the sheets were ripped or anything, but they were scattered throughout the room along with the pillows. By this time, it wasn't uncommon for an employee to hear footsteps coming up the stairs from the basement, only for no one to be there or have the feeling of being watched in the basement. He said he can't remember the first time someone actually saw a ghost, but believes it would be around the same time as the bed incident. One thing that is interesting to note, though, is he has never once been told of any tactile experience. Now comes the darker information I was told in the entire hotel's run. There's only ever been one person that passed on the hotel's property, and it's possibly the reason for the woman in white. As some context, since the hotel property was converted farmland, there are woods next to the hotel because the developers decided to preserve nearby naturally beautiful for the hotel. In these woods there are trails to hike if the guests feel so inclined, and a pond people could swim in. However, in 2007, a woman who was staying at the hotel drowned in the pond, and ever since then, we do not tell guests that the pond is in the woods, and if the guests do find it on their own, there's now a sign saying no fishing, no swimming, no ice skating for liability purposes. My boss personally believes it's her spirit people see around the hotel, because no one else has perished on the property. However, that being said, he believes the other activity experienced by people could be due to workers who have perished on the farm due to work injuries and not moving on. In the room I had mentioned previously, where the lights came back on after I had turned them off, a medium stayed there one night because she was in town for one of her shows. She had requested to stay in a room that had reported paranormal experiences, so she was placed in that room. She stays for 2 nights, and when she's checking out, she told us what she experienced while staying there. Just as a warning, I wasn't present for what the medium said, but was relayed to me by my boss. The medium said that while in that room, she made contact with only one spirit, and it was of a 6-year-old boy. Now this is where it gets weird, but confirms that the spirit in that place is from when the land was still a farm. The boy would be mischievous and do little things around that room, like turn on lights and stuff, but then none of the spirits in the hotel are there to harm people. This is coming from a medium, so take that as you will. I personally believe she was telling the truth about the spirits not meaning us any harm, mainly because no one has ever been hurt, as they usually do not even make themselves known to guests. It's mostly us staff. We were a bunch of naive kids traveling abroad in 1992, and our 2-week beach vacation turned into 2 nights of horror. Ever since our sophomore year, my high school gang of friends dreamed and planned for an epic trip to Cancun in Mexico. One of us saw a movie and thought it would be an amazing destination for us to escape the New England winter and celebrate surviving the high school experience. There were 6 of us on the plan. Keith, our unofficial leader, lost his dad his junior year, and so this trip became our way of keeping him thinking ahead to something good. Greg and Kirk were big history and archaeology buffs, so they were as interested in the Mayan ruins as the beach and beer. Dorothy and Hannah were gamer girls, a rare thing in my area, and were up for a trip to the beach with their big brothers, and I was just looking forward to an adventure. Unfortunately, we couldn't go the year we graduated. Some of us had to put our savings towards college or other experiences, and 2 of us got jobs that wouldn't allow the time off. Despite this, we had a pact to make it happen. A year passed, then another. It was 5 years before Keith phoned us to say he had booked not just a room or suite for us, but an entire house on the beach for 2 weeks. 5 of us were back in our hometown for the holidays, and we met up at a bar and had a great reunion. And Keith showed us the brochure he received from the travel company. The place was gorgeous, almost gaudy in its gold trimmings and ritzy amenities. Clearly the house was going to be expensive, even split 6 ways. But it wasn't. In fact, it was a bargain for 2 weeks. What's wrong with it? That was Kirk's question. But we all were thinking it. Keith explained that it's the hurricane that swept through and had depressed the local economy, so these outlying properties were booking to try and keep up with the more prosperous city of Cancun. The house was nearer the village of Puerto Juarez, but near all the same attractions as Tulum and Ixmal. And we could go to any beach we wanted, take a boat trip to Isla Mujeres or even Belize if we wanted to, for a third of our original estimate. We tentatively agreed because we knew Keith vetted the place before committing to it. He had already put down the deposit and set the weeks based on the hold, and we all put it in the calendar. It was late in the season of the following year. The truth was that we were all getting older and moving on. Some of us were in relationships and planning for weddings. Greg already had a baby on the way with his fiancée, so time was running out on our childhood dream before we would part ways for good. Fast forward 9 months and the day arrived. I had digested travel guides and had everything I needed. I took the cheapest flight, which meant layovers and switching gates, so I arrived later in the afternoon. I happened to meet Dorothy at the baggage claim. We remarked how grown up we both looked, shared a few hugs, and agreed to share a cab to our vacation villa. We waited in a long line to be married up with one of the taxis lining the arrival area, caught up on the latest gossip and life events, and entered vacation mode. Dorothy was getting married in the spring and moving to Europe. Hannah had to back out at the last minute because of work, but sent her love. When it was our turn, we were paired with this old, rusty bucket of Chevy steel driven by an older man who swept us up with the grace of a ballroom dancer and the smile of a car salesman looking to make quota. His name was Paulo, and he wasted no movement getting our bags into the trunk and us in the back seat. "Where do we go?" I gave him the address, and he looked at me in the rearview mirror. "Eh?" I repeated, and he nodded, still somehow confused. After reporting to someone on the radio and including the address twice, it sounded like even the dispatcher was confused. He switched turn signals and began to merge right against the flow of traffic, exiting the airport towards the city. He quoted us a price and I agreed. We headed down an empty lane into the growing shadow of dusk while most folks were heading into the bright lights of Cancun. The road was 2 lanes and covered with litter. Shortly beyond the on-ramp, we passed a tent city crowded with people and torches being lit to illuminate families living in squalor. Toddlers and children without clothes sat in the dirt and under makeshift tent homes. Further down the road, beached vessels lay on their sides, sunken into the sand or soil. Families with the means had converted them into homes by cutting holes in the hull to make doorways and windows. Stray, skinny dogs and cats patrolled the roads for food, stopping to glare as we drove slowly past. There were few people on the road in the growing darkness. We had moved into the long shadow of the Yucatan rainforest, on a road following the beach. The ocean was dazzling in the early evening, and Dorothy focused on that while I kept an eye inland. Paolo, too, wasn't as cheerful or talkative once he knew where we were going. "You know people in Puerto Juarez?" he said. I shook my head. "No, a friend rented a house." "Rented a house?" He nodded, pretending to understand but remained skeptical. "It's a very dangerous place. You must be very careful." Dorothy stiffened in her seat a bit. We had entered the forest just a bit, which obscured her view of the beach. She looked at me as if to ask, what did we get into? A mile more down the road, we emerged from the trees to again drive along the beach, inland. Bright, jaundiced security lights bathed a strip mall which included a market and a few odd shops. The only market was opened and housed half a dozen or so taxis with drivers enjoying beers and sodas in the parking lot. Paolo honked and waved as we passed the men that cheered. He smiled, and the presence of pleasant people relaxed us a bit, but his smile faded as soon as we went around the corner. Another half-mile or so and the road was dark. In the headlights, we made out some figures in the distance standing in the road. A few teenagers were standing in the road. A couple held flashlights and all of them carried heavy sticks, and Paolo began to slow down. "Gang of kids," Paolo said. "They want to collect the toll." Dorothy grabbed my arm. I had heard about something like this. "How much?" Paolo shook his head. "We no stop." He accelerated towards the kids on the road, and at the last moment, they dove for the shoulders as the taxi roared through. Dorothy dove into my lap, and we ducked down as the back of the taxi was pelted with rocks. We continued on. Paolo got on the radio and reported it, then mumbled to himself, perhaps regretting getting this fare. We arrived at the address shortly after. Despite the photographs emphasizing the dazzling facade and gardens, the exterior of the property was wrapped in a 20-foot wall of concrete, clocks topped with layers of clumpy cement into which hundreds of jagged bottle pieces were mounted in place of what might have been barbed or razor wire. The driveway was blocked by a tall steel gate and an intercom. Paolo had to buzz in. The gate whined and scraped open against the corrosion and lack of lubrication, taking forever to open wide enough for us to enter. All the while, Paolo and I kept watch on the darkness for sign of those kids on the road. As soon as we got into the property, Paolo kept insisting that they close the gate, as he pulled under an overhang at the door. Fortunately, the gate began to close itself. The front door opened, and our three buzzed dude bros poured out onto the driveway. They firemen handled our luggage into the house, and we all began to hug and laugh. Paolo kept watch on the gate, distracted as Keith asked him about the possibility of driving them to Chichen Itza the next morning. Late, of course, so that they could sleep in and have breakfast. Once the gate was closed, Paolo was himself again. Sure, he would be happy to take 3, maybe 4 in his taxi. It would take an all-day trip, and he quoted the price. Keith agreed, and Paolo prepared to head out. "You keep the place tight so the bedbugs no bite. I come back 9 tomorrow." Keith let the warning slip over his head. It occurred to me that he, Greg, and Kirk got there during the day, so they most likely had a much more positive experience than we did. Paolo waited outside the gate to make sure it closed before driving off. I also noticed he was returning to town with a wingman in a taxi, who turned around on the road to hail him. The house had been carefully photographed to avoid capturing ugly concrete walls. Some of the walls looked to have been recently rebuilt, and the older blocks had holes in the interior that were patched up with cement. We went inside where the guys had already started playing D&D and drinking. The interior of the house exceeded the grandeur alleged by the photos. The place had a sunken living room with comfortable sofas and chairs, a spiral staircase up to the sleeping level, and a massive dining area with a chef's kitchen attached. We got the quick tour of the place, but Dorothy and I were both exhausted from a day of travel, capped by the ride from the airport. We both had cervezas from the fridge, noting that the pantry had been stocked by the owner prior to our arrival. Keith had already cooked dinner, but we were able to feed off the remaining fajitas and bowls of junk food on the gaming table. I didn't want to roll up a character so late in the evening, but I hung out at the table with my friends, happy to listen to the pattern of our gaming once again. We were all older, spoke a little slower, and thoughtfully, but it was like being home. One of the things I noticed about the house was that it didn't look out onto the beach, at least not directly. The tall concrete wall blocked the view from our first floor patio. The pool was lit from inside, casting the yard in a peaceful blue glow. Linking the property to the beach was another tall steel security gate, through which I could make out a narrow sliver through the light of the rising crescent moon. This made sense in a way. Under Mexican law, all beaches were public spaces. The property line ended at the wall. My thought was interrupted by something Keith said. "The phone doesn't work." "What?" "Yeah, we were tired, so we were going to call for a taxi to take us into town to a restaurant, but the phone doesn't work." I felt a little nervous about that. None of us had cell phones. Keith, however, didn't seem bothered. "The owner's great. He lives in Puerto Juarez. I'll get in touch with him after we get back from the pyramids tomorrow night." Dorothy and I hadn't planned to take the long trip to the pyramids. We both planned to ease into the vacation by taking a trip to the beach and getting tanned. I wasn't comfortable spending the entire day without a lifeline. It wasn't an insurmountable problem, as I started working out ways to maybe take a cab into Puerto Juarez in the morning for Keith and see if I could fix the problem. A loud buzzer sounded, and all of us jumped. The same echoed through the entire main floor, like a game show buzzer sounding at the incorrect answer, except for longer. As soon as it stopped, it buzzed again. Keith rose from his chair and walked over to a small alcove, presumably to open the gate. "Don't open the gate," Dorothy and I said in a duet. Kirk and Greg laughed. Keith stopped and shot us an odd look as the buzzer sounded yet again. "I'm not." He opened a panel in the alcove that contained a small security monitor and intercom. He squinted to see what was on the monitor. I stood up and walked over. As I did, Keith muttered, "Bunch of kids." One kid was mugging for the camera and crushing the buzzer. It was a fuzzy image, but the fisheye lens in the security light gave us a look of about 10 people, not just kids, but men, women, and a few dogs milling around them. The one gazing into the camera wanted to be seen. It might have been the lateness of the hour or my own paranoia, but I recognized him as one of the kids blocking the road on our way to the house. "Ignore them," I suggested. The buzzer went off and everyone got annoyed. Dorothy put her face in her hands. It bothered her more than the rest for some reason. "Can you kill that buzzer?" "I dunno," Keith shrugged. He searched the intercom and hit the power button. The buzzer ended abruptly. It seemed as though the kid mashing the button knew this, because he immediately stopped and stepped back from the panel. He glared at the camera, the light washing out all his features except his eyes, full of mischief and a little anger. The group huddled together in the small groups, backs turned to the camera. Keith, unnerved by this, flipped the power back on and pushed the talk button. I didn't have time to say anything against this. "Hey, what can we do for you guys?" The group laughed so hard we could hear them inside the house. The kid stepped up to the intercom again, pressed the talk button and said something in Spanish that I barely made out to mean he wanted food and booze, and maybe to come inside and party with us. In English, he added, "We can bring in women and some ganja. Have a real good time, see?" We all looked at one another, not to discuss the proposal, but the ridiculousness of it. "Sorry, we're all partied out," Keith said, thinking of calling it a night. The gang outside talked amongst themselves for a bit. The spokesperson considered this and then hit the talk button again. "No, I don't think you'll sleep tonight." And the group ran off in different directions, and the spokeskid grinning wide as he glared into the camera and backed away. He left the camera heading around the exterior wall. Dorothy stood up and went looking for something that turned out to be a bottle of tequila. She was shaking. Greg went to talk to her because they had always been close. I had learnt later that Dorothy and her fiancé were victims of a home invasion 6 months ago in Baltimore. They were tied up and robbed at gunpoint in the middle of the night. This was a massive trigger for her. "We need eyes upstairs," Keith said. "Someone needs to be able to see over the wall. I have security cameras here and there beachside." Kirk and I looked at the spiral stairs up the landing. Keith called up, "Keep the lights off." We did. I went to a beachside bedroom and peered out the sliding glass door to the balcony. There was no window overlooking the side of the house. They were probably clinging to the wall to avoid to be seen. I sat on the king-size bed and quickly decided that that was a bad idea because I immediately felt sleepy, despite the adrenaline of being put under siege, and I stood up. Just then, a volley of stones rose from behind the wall. A dozen or more softball and golf ball sized stones caught in the light of the pool area, smashing down on the sand and concrete. Some made it to the balcony, bouncing off the metal railings before rolling into the pool. The crackling stones sounded like gunfire, and Dorothy screamed from the other room. Immediately, the backyard and beach were flooded with white light from the towers erected at the corners of the property. The jagged glass atop the walls sparkled, and I could see shadows cast towards the surf and the top of the heads as small groups stepped back and launched another volley of stones. Some aimed at the lights, while others came soaring at the patio window. None of the rocks aimed at the building reached the windows, they bounced off the railing or the patio overhang. The rocks aimed at the lights just bounced off without effect. Kirk called my name from the front of the house, and I rushed out of the room, down the hall, and into a smaller bedroom where he was pointing out to the front wall. Someone had thrown a heavy blanket up over the top of the wall, a thick one, like one of the moving blankets they rent at U-Haul. He made out the top of a ladder. I looked around for whatever reason and picked up the old radio clock beside the twin bed. I yanked the cord out, wrapped it around the clock, and Kirk gave me the look he gives when I do something stupid or pointless in our weekly D&D game. It wasn't until I got outside on the patio that my conscious brain caught up with what I was going to do. Just as a man's head peeked over the wall, I launched the clock as hard as I could like a frisbee across the yard, the 30 feet or so in his direction. It flew low to one side, but shattered when it hit the glass and concrete, showering the man in shrapnel. It hurt, and startled him enough that he slipped off the ladder out of sight. He landed with a crash and a painful cry. The floodlights burst to life in the front of the house, lighting up the road beyond. A handful of frightened kids scattered carrying their friend who looked really hurt. The sound of stones hitting the house continued out back, and there was shouting. Kirk ran back to where Dorothy and Greg were huddled together in the bedroom, and I heard him shout, "Make sure they're not scaling the walls out back or charging the gate." Convinced they had abandoned their charge on the front wall, I returned to the rear bedroom and gathered the white stones that had ended up on the patio. Plumes of white smoke rose from outside the walls, curling in the security lights. Some more rocks flew into the yard, but they were all weak hurls landing into the pool with no effect. With about 8 stones in my arms, I returned to the main floor. Keith was at the alcove switching between 3 monitors and a black screen. "They got one of the side cameras," he said. "What are they burning?" "I think they're burning the beach furniture." Half of them ran off. The other ones are back, and the older ones, and someone started launching Roman candles at the house from the beach. Dorothy began screaming as the fireball struck the overhang and sliding glass door. Bottle rockets followed, along with an assortment of small explosives. A couple of quarter sticks landed just inside the wall, and the concussive power rattled the windows. One destroyed a deck chair and turned the small flower garden into a crater. Then it stopped. The security lights remained on for 5 minutes until a lack of motion reset the compound in darkness. We had to adjust, and it was a frightening moment as Keith scanned the security cameras for a long while. There were no signs of them. Kirk suggested they run up the road or beach, but then the kid from the monitor walked up to the front gate again, a big grin on his face, and was carrying a handgun, displayed clearly for us to see on the monitor. He shook the camera and pushed the talk button. "No, I don't think you're gonna sleep tonight." He spit on the camera and walked away. None of us did, except for Dorothy, if you count passing out from tequila and horror. We estimated we had about 7 hours until dawn. Kirk argued that everyone who came out was either asleep or celebrating their victory over the tourists back at whatever clubhouse they shared. He wasn't ready to sleep though. We sat in candlelight to get the best view outside the windows. Greg patrolled upstairs for a while and then joined us in the dining room. The doors were open and the screen shut so we could hear anyone gathering out back, but only heard the gentle roll of surf. "If they come back, the lights will go on," Greg said. "If the police drive by and see that rug on the wall, maybe they'll check in." To be honest, we hadn't seen any lights, except that of the moon and the ocean since the gang departed. It was a beautiful scene. To be honest, I tried to relax and have a few Coronas to help, but we told stories of our glory days to keep awake, and even had to shush ourselves from keeping from waking Dorothy. It was around 3 in the morning when the security light out front goes on again. We didn't have the energy to be startled, but responded immediately. I checked the security monitor. It was a couple of people there to collect the ladder and the rug. Pulling the rug down triggered the lights, and they quickly ran off back up the road into the dark. Tiny pixels of light shone in the distance as they switched on flashlights. The rest of the morning remains a fuzzy memory. I may have drifted off, and may have the others, but none of us slept. Sunrise gave us all the confidence, and Keith immediately conspired with Greg and Kirk to power nap before Paolo returned to take them on the all-day trip inland. I said we should go to the police and get the phone fixed before the 3 of them left the property in the hands of an exhausted me and already terrified Dorothy. Shortly after dawn, Dorothy came downstairs in a swimsuit, walked past us without a word and walked into the pool. She dunked herself and began fishing stones out from the bottom. I helped Keith make breakfast and things began returning to normal. Keith agreed to postpone the trip until we could file a complaint and get the phone settled. We ate and agreed to ask Paolo to put us in touch with the authorities. When the buzzer sounded again, we all jumped a little, but it was Paolo. We let him into the compound. He was dressed for comfort, ripped jean shorts and an old golf shirt with sandals. We explained the night before and he didn't seem surprised, except for the part about the phone being out. He walked with Keith around the side and confirmed his suspicion that the line had been cut outside the wall. The line could be fixed, but just as easily be cut again. With this done, Keith phoned the owner to let him know what had happened. According to Keith, he feigned concern and promised to use his connections in Cancun and Puerto Juarez to increase police patrols the next night and hand over the security tape to the officers who would come and investigate. Convinced this would solve all our problems, Keith, Kirk and Greg left the house late, but to put in the full day's hours away at the Chichen Itza site. Paolo pulled me aside and handed me a small metal case. He patted me on the shoulder as if confident I'd know what to do with it. Inside was a handgun with 2 magazines. Startled, I took it inside and wiped it down for prints, but I kept it in the kitchen. Dorothy said nothing all day, getting out the pool and showering. She sat on the patio outside the dining room and read a book. When the police showed up 4 hours later, I brought them in and explained everything. One of them spoke English well enough, and explained the house we rented had been owned by a local drug trafficker. He wasn't exactly a kingpin, but he was able to keep a nice residence until his life was terminated. It was brought up by a local businessman, but tourists, for some reason, didn't like the idea of being this far away from the protected tourist zone. The kids were probably locals with nothing better to do than harass Americans, and we should relax and have a good time. They didn't even want to see the playback, they just took the VHS tape and wished us well, assuring us that a car would drive by at least once an hour overnight. I didn't mention that a lot could happen in an hour's time. I kept checking the phone line, as if the sudden lack of a dial tone was my first alert for trouble. I thought that if they could cut the phone, they could probably cut the power almost as easily, but I didn't share any of this with Dorothy. I made lunch, but Dorothy didn't want to eat. She didn't want to talk either. She'd sat tensely in the sitting room with her book. I collected the stones from the pool area and piled them by the door. I cleaned up the debris and then spent some hours soothing my nerves with beer, Jimmy Buffett songs, and a network of pool needles serving as a raft. The guys never settled on a time they should return. Paolo said not to even try because they had to drive through the jungle and there might be any number of delays or detours. It was best to be home by sundown. So when the sun fell behind the trees that second night and they had not returned, I started to get concerned. There had been talks of playing a D&D adventure or just some card game that night, so their intention was not to be out too late. Dorothy had taken a nap in the middle of the day, but never went back outside after her swim. She returned to her chair with another book and went right into it. She refused dinner, but I made her something anyway, hoping the smell would just jumpstart her appetite. I felt like a well-treated prisoner. People walked along the road outside the compound, sometimes peering into the upstairs window to catch a glimpse at the tourists. Others lounged on the beach beyond the gate. It was probably safe for us to go out there, but we weren't taking a chance. In the end, the night fell over the house again, and with just Dorothy and me inside it. When the security lights went off again, it was around 8 in the evening. I had drifted off. It was the front side of the house, and I didn't see anyone outside the wall. When I got to the front door and looked out the peephole, I saw one man standing in the yard. He didn't have a weapon in his hand, but I wasn't sure if he was armed. He just stood there in the floor light staring at the front door, then to one side of the unused garage, and then to the downstairs bedroom on the opposite side. Dorothy got up and went to the phone. There was a dial tone, but dialing 911 left her with a dead line. She tried a few more times without success. At that moment, the buzzer sounded. Fearing another attack, I retreated to the security monitors and saw Paolo's cab outside. I buzzed them through. When the gate began to move, the man in the yard fled to the back of the house. It took a while for the car to get inside, and I moved to get the weapon from the case in the kitchen. The man raced to the back gate. As I suspected, it was accessible from the inside as he threw it open. As he did, about 5 men rushed forwards, only to be stopped by the man inside and motioned to run, which they all did. With the rest of the gang back in the compound, Paolo told us he radioed police when he saw a bunch of creeps outside the wall. They were at the market and were on their way. The 3 men were deeply tanned and a little drunk from their experience, which they promised had a moment similar to the night before. Soon after, the police arrived outside the compound and they interviewed Paolo and the rest of us. They had Polaroids of the people they caught near the marketplace and took our word when we positively identified them as the man in the yard and the others trying to get in. It was all they needed to not only arrest them, but to round up the other kids that harassed us the previous night. Settling in, I returned the weapon to Paolo, but he offered to sell it to me for $50. I can't say if I took him up on it or not, but the rest of us felt a lot safer for the remaining 12 days of our trip. We even took to the beach as a group. It took a while, but Dorothy began to settle in. After 3 nights of no issues, we all slept through the night and had the adventures we'd been dreaming of for 8 years. This story takes place when I lived on my old property. I was a little boy, maybe 8 or 9. You see, the cul-de-sac I lived in was a fairly nice neighborhood, nothing crazy. My room was across from my parents, just down a long hall and next to my sister's room. My brother and I shared rooms and a bunk bed. Everything was fine until my sister reached her teen angst phase. Then came the doll. It was a creepy-looking porcelain doll with a black tutu and had a punk rock kind of motif, and she loved it. She got it from her godmother, a woman we no longer speak to. My brother and my mum and I never liked the thing because it gave us the creeps, but hey, it was her doll. However, slowly but surely we began to see a change in her. She was beginning to become more reclusive and angry with my mother for no reason at all, and even cut herself in front of me once. Weird, yes, but nothing quite supernatural. Then she began to sleepwalk. At first we thought it was normal, maybe just stress from being a teenage girl, I don't know, but she started to creep me out. And because of this I began to lock the door at night after my brother fell asleep. And on one of these nights I heard her get up from her bed and slowly walk. I was in my top bunk, mind you, watching under the door when I saw her shadow. See, as my room is across from my parents', I couldn't tell if she was standing there in front of my room or my parents', but it was still very creepy, and she stood there for an unnatural amount of time. On the last occasion, we all awoke one morning to a knife under my parents' bedroom door, and this just made them flip out. They weren't scared, they were more concerned about my sister being nuts and homicidal, since she'd been acting so strangely. Things went on for a little bit, until one day the doll disappeared and my sister came out furious, huffing and puffing, but no one in the house seemed to have an inkling about its disappearance. And so, life went on, and I never knew what happened to it, until I asked my dad about it years later, and he enlightened me. It turns out that my godmother was heavily into black magic and Santeria, and had a deep hate for my mother over some petty squabble they had before my father and mother were married, and held a deep resentment for her. I guess firstborn females of the family is important in Santeria, and so when she saw an opportunity she gave my sister that horrible doll we hated. But what actually happened to the doll was the funniest part. My mum is super religious, and I guess at some point she had soaked the doll in holy water and left it in the trash for the garbage man to take out to the dump the next day. Another funny thing, my sister never sleepwalked again. I've had a few frightening encounters over the span of my life, but nothing quite as intense as one that took place on a night during my senior year of high school. I had been managing the latest in a series of successive breakups with my high school sweetheart, and I was looking for any reason I could find not to sequester myself into my computer room as I so often did. My friend Mia, who lived in a neighboring community, had invited me over to her place to hang out with her and her brother. I was a socially awkward teenager, and Mia being a fairly recent acquaintance, I accepted on the condition that I could bring along a frequent companion of mine, Robert. He was always prepared to hang out, and I could confirm his presence there before even asking him. She was hesitant of bringing another person round, but when I promised her we'd set off some of Robert's fireworks, she agreed. Mia had conditions of her own, stressing the importance of calling her to come pick us up as soon as we arrived at the transit station. I thought it was a bit of an odd request. I had been to Mia's house before, and it was only a short walk from the station. I didn't think to ask her why, as I was just pleased to be going anywhere. "Oh, and you have to bring your fireworks," I told Robert. After grumbling, he gathered up the small cachet that he had stashed under his bed and we headed out. Robert and I arrived at the station around 11, and I did as Mia had instructed. Not expecting an invite that late in the evening, my cell phone was left uncharged, with enough juice to let Mia know that we had arrived. As Robert and I whiled away the time singing 80s tunes in an off-key rhythm, a black SUV with tinted windows came streaming into the parking area next to the station, swerving wildly and honking before it shot off into the suburban community we were heading towards. Mia arrived shortly after, and we made our way towards the schoolyard. Robert was still a bit prickly about wasting the last of his fireworks, which was fairly uncharacteristic of him, as he presented himself as one of the most habitually apathetic people I had ever met up until that point. We had set off a handful of fireworks. A few of them were duds, but most of them did what they were designed for, attracting attention. Another black SUV came barreling down the road by the school a few minutes later. This one had a collection of balloons tied to the interior of the car that flew out a rearview window, battering against one another as the SUV came to a sudden halt. Mia's face held a look of knowing concern that I didn't entirely understand. "I'll be right back," she told us. I held my breath from a distance as I witnessed a figure hop out of the passenger seat of the SUV and approach Mia. I let out a heavy sigh of relief, as their greeting, while out of earshot, was warm. There was a rapport and friendliness not commonly reserved for foreboding strangers you meet, with the hour creeping closer to midnight, and the lights in the surrounding homes growing increasingly scarce. Mia was the type of gal you couldn't help but like. She was bright, funny, talented, and never did much to offend anyone. She treated everyone on equal terms, and a natural byproduct of this is collecting friends of every high school archetype. Some of those archetypes were one of the ones I was all too familiar with, the jocks, bullies, and bad seeds, the latter of which her district high school had a notorious reputation for. By that point in my life, I was already content with the knowledge that the flaring tempers between most individuals of every identifiable clique would simmer with age. But there would always be the select few that never quite got over the thrill of illicit dealings and physical violence. Their behavior would escalate, and they'd step into the criminal lifestyle at a young adult, where their actions became less excusable. I was, and still am, a tiny male at 28 years old, never growing beyond 5'4", and an easy target for such a person. I had the reputation for being a mischievous but laid-back slacker who could take a punch but couldn't throw one, and I relied on the former trait to diffuse tension between situations outside my tribe. It didn't always work, but it allowed me to skate by relatively unharmed for most of my high school career. Mia embraced the stranger in a hug before they parted ways. The stranger got back into the SUV and peeled off. When she returned, I asked her what that was all about. That was a friend of mine from St. Francis High. They're out celebrating his buddy's 18th birthday and driving around and beating the crap out of people walking by themselves. You're alright if you're with me, but I think we should probably head back to my place. Fine by me. I'd rather not be party to some kid's twisted adulthood initiation rites as he proves his machismo to his buddies while they take turns packing my face in. We arrived to Mia's house, but the mood had turned pretty sour and contemplative as we sat with very little to discuss aside from the obvious. We got about 20 minutes into a movie before Mia's father walked in. "Mia, it's 12. Time to say goodnight to your friends." Mia explained the situation, but being an honest student with overly invested parents can sometimes mean bearing the burden of strict rules. One, being in bed by 12. The other, no safe harboring for teenaged boys overnight. Christ, what had we gotten ourselves into? Mia told us that there were 4 of the SUVs driving around. She asked us to be safe before saying goodbye and locking the door behind her. Robert and I slowly walked off the porch and into the cul-de-sac. A disappointing evening, but it happens. I took my cell phone from my pocket to trouble my best friend for a ride, but had forgotten that I didn't charge it earlier and the battery had since died. Robert didn't bother to carry a cell phone with him and communicated with the few people he did hang out with over MSN Messenger. We took inventory of what we had left with us before taking off towards the transit station. My pockets were virtually empty, save for my wallet. Robert had a single remaining firework in his possession, along with his Zippo lighter. There was a house down the street that I recalled was being renovated, with one of those industrial-shaped disposal bins out front. I leapt inside and re-emerged hefting a 2x4 with a few nails bent into it. Robert laughed at the visual. "Call me Buford Pusser Jr. I'm walking small," I cracked. Robert had his Zippo and a firework at the ready. "I'll shoot this in their face," he said. It sounded as if we were in high spirits. It's because the risk of our situation hadn't quite sunken in yet. We were aware that the transit station would be shutting relatively soon, and the train wouldn't be any help, and this particular station held the final terminal on the line, but the buses might still be active. The neighborhood we had started in had enough walkways, bike lanes, and tree cover that we could sink our way through the shadows for a while. We took our time choosing the most secluded and unlit passageways, which in hindsight I realized did nothing to help our nerves. At one point we came up to an intersecting walkway that we were familiar with in the daytime. The passageway ahead of us was lit overhead by a single yellow streetlight, before fading into the yawning mouth of pitch darkness. We stood there, agonizing for several minutes over whether or not we should find another route or stay the course, listening for any sound of movement on the other side. We briefly contemplated camping out for the remainder of the night before opting for another detour. The night's silence was punctuated every so often by the squealing of tires, shouting, or the sudden acceleration of a vehicle. Then we reached the main road. Not only one of the main roads in the area, but one of the main roads in our end of town. From there on there was little cover, nothing but houses, buildings, and a large empty parking lot, all illuminated by streetlights that, at that moment, felt more like the halogen floodlights they shine on escaped prisoners as they rush across the yard to freedom. There was little traffic at this point in the night, so if one of the SUVs did come down the road, we would not go unnoticed, and there'd be virtually nothing to stop them from doing what they were intending to do. We listened for any sign of obnoxious motors revving before we took off across the road and into the parking lot. Less than a minute later, we arrived at the transit station. We quickly checked the posted bus times, but as indicated by the digital clock outside, all the buses had made their final run. We hopped into the shelter in the train terminal, but the doors had already been locked. We'd have to stick to the main road until we made it to the bus trap. The bus trap was our safe haven. What's unique to this bus trap is that it was right under a tightly constructed underpass that divides one community from another. After years of drivers still risking the odds to make their trip shorter, the underpass had been fitted with added precautions, cement blockades, and a metal gate that only opened for buses. This would increase our chances of making a clean getaway if the birthday boy and his pals sped towards us. Robert and I flinched to every distant sound, unaware of whether it was an ordinary motorist on their way home after a late evening, or the assailants we were so concerned with running into. We began to think that maybe we were overreacting. There was a good chance that someone had already phoned the police on them, and they had taken off to another area to avoid detection. Maybe they'd gone home, or better yet, gotten arrested. We let our guard slip as we reached our old junior high, starting to think that the worst case scenario we were preparing for was already behind us. That I was carrying a cumbersome piece of wood only looked like a jackass, that Robert was still armed with a firework and his Zippo for nothing. This is where I remember the set of walkways leading straight through the community towards an elementary school which was right by the bus trap. I had walked it plenty of times before, and with the streetlights spaced out every 60 feet, we'd see them from a mile away, but they'd see us too. What we were greeted with instead were long expanses of burnt-out streetlight, another sparsely lit tunnel of shadows, and nightmares. We started down the path, because what other choice did we really have? Robert flicked his Zippo open as much as he could, still careful to conserve his lighter fluid in case of an actual confrontation. The walk didn't last long. The oversensitive backlight porches helped to fill in dark points, but there reached a point where it was getting too dark, where you couldn't see your hand in front of your face, and the accompanying sound of snapping twigs and branches was enough to signify that we might want to just get the hell out of there. We stood paralyzed for a moment, imagining the birthday boy and his friends waiting behind the shadow to pummel us. Though, sensing it had just been an animal, we returned to the quieter neighborhood areas. There may be more room for us to be seen, but less risk of getting cornered. We quickly made our way along unfamiliar streets and joined up with the final walkway to see it. The elementary school, and in the distance, the bus trap. We were so relieved to see safety in our sights, walking at a relaxed pace and feeling foolish for turning a 20-minute walk into an hour-long ordeal. We passed through the elementary school grounds and began walking the fully lit streets down the bus trap, when a black SUV came whipping around the corner on the left-hand side nearest the bus trap, balloons from the rear window streaking backwards from the velocity as the vehicle accelerated. There's no way they didn't see us. Crap, I shouted at Robert as we doubled back towards the elementary school and rounded the corner. We both had to think fast, as the road they were on was only a 15-second drive at the speed they were doing. We ran down the street along the elementary school but found no cover. I heard the engine grow closer to us within seconds of turning into the street. We were out of time, and I pointed to the only cover I could find, a side yard fence. No accompanying front fence, no attaching hedge, nothing. Robert and I lied down on the grass against the fence, long like boards and stiff as corpses, our respective weapons at the ready. I have never felt my heart pump as hard as it was at that moment, tightly gripping the 2x4 while I watched Robert position the firework and unclap the Zippo. As if this was going to do anything, we really were chumps. The SUV slowed to a roll as it turned the corner, the headlights reaching down the road as they were searching for us. Convinced they wouldn't find us in the car, they parked. They parked at the edge of the property, right next to us. The headlights of the SUV were peeking out just beyond the fence. We were beyond screwed. 4 doors popped open, and within a few seconds, each to each other, feet kicking up gravel as the birthday gang murmured to one another and began to search for us. I noted at least 4 sets of footsteps and a couple of indistinct voices. We were definitely outnumbered. My mind flashed through all the numerous times I'd been pushed about at school, laughing good-naturedly as I refused to fight back in futility. I knew everyone who did this to me, and this humanized me to them enough that they never pushed it too far. These people didn't know me. They weren't aware of the bullshit persona I assumed. The odd guy who was alright with pain. They didn't know I pretended to think I was funny. These guys wanted to hurt me. They wanted to hurt me and my friend. This is it, I thought. This is the moment you quit being such a coward and you earn your own respect. I gripped the 2x4 tightly enough to dig tiny wooden splinters into my hand, and just listened to my heart thump as my blood boiled with whatever rage I could summon. I would only have a slim opportunity to surprise them before they'd take us down, and I hoped that Robert would get his firework off soon enough to buy us some time. If I was only getting in one strike, I was going to make sure it connected. As if some force miraculously knew what we were up against, I heard a voice say, "Screw it." A few seconds later, the car doors slammed shut. The SUV backed up, pulled a U-turn and drove off. All the courage I had to muster, everything I was prepared to fight with in a losing battle that I never knew my body had in me, and it all slowly settled back into the deepest regions of myself. Robert and I walked the quiet back route to the bus trap. We arrived at the underpass and casually walked through it. We both took a moment to look back into the other community that we had spent so much of our time in without issue, now in recognition of what we just had narrowly avoided. It felt like the type of thing a person should do. I wish I could say this near brush had some transformative effect on me, that it forced me to re-examine my passive tendencies and open up a new chapter in my life where I stopped letting myself be treated like everyone else's ragdoll. It didn't, not necessarily. My one takeaway from this experience was, despite my many previous assumptions about my fight or flight response, it proved that in a rare moment when I'm backed into a corner, I'll be prepared to stand my ground. Until then, birthday gang, let's not meet again. Over 10 years ago, during the summer, my friend's 13-year-old niece Katie flew home from Boston, Massachusetts to Florida for a week-long visit. Her plane was arriving at the Jacksonville airport, so my friend and I hop into my little red 4-door Colorado truck and drive the 3 hours from Tallahassee, Florida, to Jacksonville, Florida, to pick her up. Yes, there's an airport in Tallahassee. However, it is a small airport and quite expensive to fly in and out of. For example, a round-trip plane ticket that would cost $300 if you used any other airport would cost about $800 if you use the Tallahassee airport. Therefore, many travelers coming to Tallahassee use other airports and drive the remaining distance, because it's cheaper in the long run. Anyway, we arrive in Jacksonville and pick up Katie. One thing I should mention in regards to myself is that I am a very good-natured and fun-loving jokester. I like to tease people, never anything mean, just good old-fashioned make you laugh fun. So after we pick up Katie and are about 10 minutes down the road, I tell her, "Hey, just so you know, I'm a narcoleptic. If I fall asleep while driving, just nudge me real hard and I'll wake up." Confused, she asks, "Are you even allowed to drive?" "Oh yes, it's really no big deal. My doctor says it's fine. I have a note and everything." At that point, my friend Chelsea and I, who have been friends for over 4 years and knows me very well, cuts her eyes towards me with a "What the hell are you up to?" look on her face and smirks. On the way home, we're laughing, joking, and having a great time. This was my first time meeting Katie, so I had a lot of questions like, what subjects do you like in school? Do you have any hobbies, a boyfriend? You know, the getting to know you type conversation. About 30 minutes into the drive and mid-sentence, I pretend to fall asleep, tilt my head back and start snoring. Now, due to the tilted angle of my head, I could still see the roadway from my ever so slightly opened eyes. I watched Katie's face through the rearview mirror, and the sheer panic and look of horror on her face was priceless. She began frantically to nudge me, trying desperately to wake me, as I pretended to snooze away. Finally, I busted out, cracking up. She laughed so hard she couldn't breathe, and Katie, while she was clutching her chest and smiling, with an expression of relief on her face, and she began laughing too. So her week-long visit started off with a good laugh. Throughout the weeks, Chelsea and her family took Katie to do many fun things, like canoeing, hiking, and trips to the beach. During the evening, after I got off work, I could go to Chelsea's house, and we would all sit on her back porch to play dice. Oh, but alas, all good things must come to an end. It was the day before Katie was supposed to leave. Chelsea and I decided to take Katie to St. Augustine, as it was only a 45-minute drive to Jacksonville from there, and St. Augustine is one of our favorite places to go. For those of you who have never been to St. Augustine, let me tell you a bit about the place. It's a historic old town on the Atlantic coast of Florida. It is actually the oldest city in the US and was founded in 1565 by Spanish settlers. The place is absolutely gorgeous, and the architecture is magnificent. There are many old shops in the center of the town, such as a store where you can make your own candles, and a coat of arms store where you can look up your family's surname and its history. There are also numerous tours of the historic buildings there, like the old fort, the jail, and the museums. There are also so many museums. The best thing about St. Augustine, at least for me and Chelsea, are the ghost tours. She and I had been on quite a few of them, and they're very interesting, so we made an agenda for the day. An afternoon of shopping, tours, and then a blissful evening of spookiness. Around 9 in the morning on Sunday, the day before Katie was supposed to depart, Chelsea, Katie, and I hopped into Chelsea's old dark green Dodge Caravan. It had much more legroom than my truck, and headed to St. Augustine. About an hour and a half into our trip, her van began to overheat. Knowing that it would be bad for the engine if we were to continue driving, we pulled over on the side of the interstate, popped the hood, and took a peek. Steam rolled out from under the hood, so the only thing we could do was wait for the vehicle to cool off before we checked it out. 30 minutes later, we took the cap off the radiator, and sure enough, there was no liquid. We desperately looked around Chelsea's van for some water, but there was nothing. The only fluids we had were a few half bottles of 2-day-old tea and a half bottle of old Coca-Cola. Nothing that we could use to put in the vehicle's radiator because of the sugar content. We started wondering what we could do. We were on the other side of the interstate. We didn't even know where we were exactly, and none of us could remember what the last mile marker was that we had passed. Now I know what you're thinking. Why didn't we just look it up on our phones? Well, this was before smartphones were widely popular, and GPS wasn't even available on them. As we're scratching our brains, trying to figure out a way out of this situation, miracle upon miracle, it started to rain hard. It was as if a tropical storm was brewing. For anyone who has ever visited or lived in Florida, summers here are usually very hot, very humid, and normally accompanied by rain. We Floridians tend to joke about the weather conditions here. If you don't like the weather, wait 5 minutes and it'll change. Relieved for our good fortune, Chelsea, Katie, and I frantically scrambled to find an empty cup, and whatever other containers Chelsea had lying around that we could catch rainwater in. Together, we found about 3 or 4 red Solo cups and strategically placed the cups in various areas. 2 cups we placed under the far end corners of the back bumper, because the rainwater was pooling and pouring onto the ground in those areas. The other cups we placed on the hood of the vehicle. We got in Chelsea's van drenched from the rain and it stopped. All that effort and the rain just stopped. We got out to see how much water we had gathered. Unfortunately, collectively, there were only perhaps 2 or 3 ounces of rainwater. What to do? This wouldn't be enough to make it get anywhere, and we didn't know where the next exit was. Should we chance driving without water? Surely between the 3 of us we could come up with an idea. I had an idea. The divots on the side of the interstate, designed to wake up drivers if they run them over. The ones were affectionately known as drunk bumps. There's rainwater in between them, but how could we get them to use for the radiator? Well, as we had the red Solo cups, but the cups alone wouldn't help get the water out of the divots. Chelsea had a straw, and then we promptly began sucking rainwater through the straw of the divots and spitting them into the cup. Nasty but necessary. Now this section of the I-10 is very wooded, but by no means desolate. There's plenty of traffic, especially on a Sunday. So while I continued to suck rainwater out the divots, Chelsea kept an eye on the traffic. Anytime a vehicle were coming, Chelsea would yell at me that I would need to move. The placement of the divots was close to the lines on the side of the road that are there to guide drivers. Therefore, I'm on my hands and knees sucking rainwater through a straw, my head approximately 5 or 6 inches into the road. If I didn't move in time, my head would have been a passerby's new tire decor. Picture this, a 25-year-old, 5-foot-tall blonde female on her knees on the side of a busy interstate, sucking rainwater from a drunk bump. while a 36-year-old, 5'9" tall blonde female is yelling at her to move. Each time she yelled, I would bounce up and back, still holding the red Solo cup in my hand and the straw in my mouth, only to drop back to my knees and suck more rainwater. After 15 minutes of doing this, we decided it was too risky to continue. We took the 1.5 to 2 ounces of water I had collected and risked my life for, and combined it with the rainwater we had for a grand total of about 3.5 to 4 ounces of water. Still not enough. We really wanted to be independent women and figure out our own mess, but we broke down and did what any damsel in distress would do. I called my boyfriend, now husband, who was working in Mississippi, which was about 10 hours from where we were. He couldn't help us directly, but he was a mechanic, and we thought that maybe he could give us some advice on what to do. Sadly, he didn't answer, so we called another friend of ours, Tom, who used to be a mechanic in the army. Fortunately for us, Tom answered his phone, and we explained the circumstances. He confirmed that the rainwater we collected wouldn't be enough, and said that we could still use it if we needed to filter it through something first to prevent dirt or debris from getting into the radiator. We were at a loss. We don't have anything to stream water, we explained. Sure you do. Use a sock. Chelsea and I didn't have any socks as we were wearing flip-flops and hadn't packed any sneakers, but Katie had all of her luggage with her and thus had socks. She graciously gave us her socks and we poured the almost 4 ounces of water through it into the radiator. This clearly wasn't enough. We don't know what else to do. We need more water, and all we have is 2-day-old tea and hot Coca-Cola. Are there any puddles by the side of the road? Tom inquired. No, we already looked. Does anyone have to pee? Pee? Chelsea said with a chuckle. Yeah, you can put urine in the radiator. It's not ideal, but it's clean and won't mess up your car. Really? Urine? Chelsea and I looked at each other in unison. Katie can pee. There is something I haven't told you yet. Katie was born with a birth defect, in which she was born without external genitalia. Basically, she was as smooth as a Barbie doll in her nether region. Therefore, she had a medically inserted port into her bladder, from which she could urinate practically on demand. The only thing Katie had to do was attach the tube to her port, and our troubles would be over. Life-saving golden liquid would flow from this magnificent child. We thanked Tom, hung up the phone and smiled, and started forcing Katie to drink the 2-day-old bottle of tea and Coca-Cola. All the while Katie complained how much she hated the taste. Can't say I blame her. The tea had been sitting in a vehicle for 2 days and definitely wouldn't taste good. And while Katie sat drinking the nasty liquids, she hooked up to her medical tubing, with a bottle at the other end. Chelsea and I converted one of the red Solo cups into a funnel and began grabbing the bottles of urine to fill up the radiator. At this point, I must tell you something about myself. I have an aversion to certain smells, urine being one of them. The smell of pure, concentrated urine. I shudder to think of it. So Chelsea had to do the honors of pouring the urine into the radiator, but I unfortunately was holding the bottles of warm liquid and handing them to her. While she's pouring them into the radiator, the smell hit me, and I began to gag, almost vomiting everywhere. In between my gagging gasps and awful retching, I'm telling Chelsea to hurry. While she's pouring the last bottle of pee, Katie is in the middle of filling up another one, and a state police officer sees us on the side of the road and pulls up behind us. Chelsea's van door is open with Katie urinating into a bottle via her medical tubing. Thoroughly embarrassed, Katie quickly slams the van door shut and tries to hide what she is doing, like a druggie trying to hide dope from the cops. I quickly kicked the previously used medical tubes that Katie had discarded on the ground, under the van, as I was afraid the officer would think we were doing something illegal. After we explained to the officer what was going on, of course leaving out the divot sucking and urine being poured into the radiator parts, he informed us in a southern drawl there's an exit only a mile down the road, and there's a gas station with a water hose. We thanked him, and with the urine-filled radiator proceeded to the gas station with the officer following us. The entire 5-minute drive to the gas station we felt like idiots, because if we'd paid attention and known exactly where we were, we could have made it to the gas station without having to go through this entire ordeal. But this is not where the story ends. We filled up the radiator with water and knew we had to get Chelsea's vehicle fixed or we wouldn't be able to make it anywhere, let alone take Katie to the airport next morning. By this time it was 6 in the evening. We decided to find a mechanic shop after asking the gas clerk where the nearest service station was. We drove a few miles down the road only to find the place had closed for the evening. Just our luck. We sat in the parking lot not knowing what to do next. We couldn't just drive around looking for a hotel. Even if we found one, what would we do the next morning? And how would we get Katie to the airport? About that time, a worker leaving the service station sees us, Bob, and asks us what our problem is. We explained to him that we were from out of town and having car trouble, and that we were trying to get Katie to the airport to catch a flight. Bob graciously decides to take a look. We pop the hood, sit in the van, and watch through the gap between the windshield and hood of the van. Bob uses a hose to fill up the radiator with water. Now, because of the urine concentration in the radiator, the water begins to foam and look like a head of beer. Bob looks confused by this. Our eyes widen, and we give each other knowing glances. We begin to quietly whisper to each other, "Oh no, pee-pee." Katie's face begins to blush from embarrassment. Baffled and unbeknownst to him, Bob proceeds to stick his index and middle finger in the urinary froth, swirl it around a few times and sniff it. He does it a few times trying to figure out what it is. At this point, I slide to my knees on the floorboard in the passenger side, buried my head in the seat, and started laughing hysterically, trying not to let Bob hear me. Chelsea followed suit. She was standing outside the driver door with her head buried in the driver's seat, laughing. We kept repeating over and over through tears and laughter, "Katie's pee," who was sitting behind us. She was mortified. She kept telling us to shut up. It was so embarrassing. We were laughing so hard we could barely breathe, with tears rolling down our face. Bob finally finished making the repairs. Turns out it was just a cracked hose leading from the radiator. He didn't even charge us, but we thanked him and gave Bob all the cash we had, which was about $20, and were on our way. Once the van was down the road, Chelsea and I both simultaneously bust out with the loudest belly laughter as we recalled the entire day's events. We made it to our hotel room in St. Augustine, although it was way too late to go on the ghost tour, and we were able to take Katie to Jacksonville the next morning to catch her flight. Everything turned out well in the end, but the entire experience is one that I'll never forget, and continues to make me laugh to this day. I guess the lesson from this event is to always carry extra water in your vehicle, and, in an emergency, urine works. I spent a year studying in Mexico recently, and as you do on exchange, I tried to travel as much as I could. Between the semester, there is a big break, and me and my buddy that I spent the most time with during the exchange decided we'd go on a longer backpacking trip through Mexico together. We had a rough plan of where to go and what we wanted to see, but we hadn't even booked our flight back yet, nor were we sure from where we would take it from. We wanted to keep it flexible. We had an amazing time, and a few days before the trip ended, we finally decided we would take our flight from a city that was close and had really cheap flights. But the city itself didn't really have anything to offer. Then, on Airbnb, we found a room very close to the airport in a house with a pool, and we thought we would just treat ourselves to a relaxed pool day at the end of the trip. It turned out that the hosts were a family. The husband was Mexican, and the wife was from Europe, and could even speak our native language. So we arranged that we would take the bus to the airport, and they would pick us up from there. When we finally arrived at the city, it was already dark, and the bus driver refused to drive us to the airport, since it was not directly on his route, so he just dropped us off on the highway. That was already a pretty bad situation to be in from the beginning, standing with our backpacks at the side of the road in the middle of nowhere, in a not-so-safe city in Mexico. But I called the hosts and sent them our GPS location, and they said no problem and that they would come to us. The husband came to fetch us, and it was a very uncomfortable situation getting into the car with a stranger in the middle of the night in the middle of nowhere. It also didn't help that the guy looked like Danny Trejo without a mustache, and as I tried to make small talk with him, he only gave monosyllabic answers or straight out ignored me. Well, he's just not a big talker, I thought, and hoped that soon we would arrive. Looking back, I can see a million red flags, but for some reason at the time, we just didn't see them, or were too tired. But we didn't really have any other choice than going with him anyway. We arrived, and that should have immediately set off alarms. We were in the middle of nowhere. There were fields with sheep and goats all around us, and a gravel road off the paved road, and along that road there were about 6 huge mansions, all with 2-meter walls around them, topped with NATO fence, huge gates, and at least 2 gigantic guard dogs per house. We entered the house and were greeted by the wife, a bubbly middle-aged woman that was very talkative and pleasant. She had actually cooked dinner for us, and we ate while exchanging small talk. The husband just sat there without a single word. After dinner, we more or less went directly to bed because it had gotten late, and we were tired from a long day. The next morning, we saw that the weather was not too good, so we decided to go into town and just do the few touristy things the place had to offer, instead of spending time at the pool. When we came back, it was already dark, but we decided to jump into the pool anyway to cool off, as it was very hot and humid. The wife joined us at some point, and my friend made the mistake to ask how they were able to afford such a house, as it didn't really match the price range of jobs they were telling us that they were doing. And she deflected a bit and added that her husband was very handy because he had grown up in the streets and basically built the house himself. We realized that it maybe wasn't the best topic of conversation and broke it off quickly. That was the last day of our trip, and we had our flight back home early next morning. We thought we could have some weed that was left over that we'd brought along with us on the trip, and it would be nice to smoke it out since it was our last night. But as this was a family home and they had kids around, we thought it would be better to speak to our hosts if they would mind. So later in the evening we asked the wife if it was okay if we smoked on the terrace, which for some reason she found quite amusing and started to laugh. She shouted to her husband, who was lying on the couch watching TV, "My love, the boys asked if it would be okay to smoke some weed. What do you think?" He laughed, but did not give an answer. We looked at her with a dumbfounded expression, and she told us, "Sure, just go ahead." So we went to the terrace and started smoking our joint. Later, they joined us and we had a chat. And this is where things got messed up. They started asking us for some reason where we got the weed, how much it was, who we got it from, and how much we would have to pay to get it back in Europe. They seemed way too interested in the weed, and at that point the wife just nonchalantly reveals to us, "Yes, we thought about doing that for a source of income selling weed, but too many people die doing that because the cartels don't like it. Actually, my husband used to kill people for doing that." I immediately felt sober. Did she just say? And as if he read my mind, her husband added, "Yes, when I was about 16, I took care of a lot of people for the cartel for money." He said it in a tone as if he just used to mow lawns when he was a teenager. I still thought I must have misunderstood, so I texted my friend who was sitting across the table from me, trying not to make eye contact because I knew we would just freak each other out. He confirmed that we had indeed understood right. We discussed what we should do, and he agreed that there's no immediate threat, and that we should just stay. We don't have anywhere else to go and it's already late. But then things got crazier. We tried to keep our composure and not completely freak out while still making conversation with our hosts. The husband, a few minutes later, got up and went inside to fetch something. He returned with a literal kilo of weed pressed into a brick. He proceeded to break bits off, roll them into a joint that would have probably knocked out Snoop Dogg. It was about the size of my thumb, and I guess it had about 2 grams of weed in there. Of course he offered it to us, but we politely declined, saying that we were already pretty stoned. He seemed a little offended, but fortunately bought our excuse. But it got worse. A few minutes later we heard a couple of loud bangs. The wife became a bit uneasy and asked, "What was that?" To which he answered calmly, 9mm. To confirm my suspicion that it had indeed been shots, I would say between 5 or 7, pretty quickly after one another. The wife's nerves didn't calm and she asked again, "What do you think they're shooting at? Cows? Air? People? Don't you think we should go inside?" But he shrugged it off, and we stayed outside. A few minutes later there were more shots, and this time even closer. The wife got even more upset and asked again, "Should we maybe go in? What do you think they're shooting at?" And I think I'll never forget when he answered in the calmest way imaginable, "No, it's okay. I didn't hear any screams yet." I don't know why, but the way he just calmly said that freaked me out, and is still making my heart beat whenever I think about it. After that, we quickly excused ourselves and went to our room, when we could finally talk, and basically both lost it and panicked. What the hell were we supposed to do? We were locked into a house with a Sicario in the middle of nowhere, and people are shooting outside. We decided it was probably our best bet to stay, because we thought, we're his guests, he's not going to harm us, hopefully, and it's better to have walls, dogs, and him in between us and the people shooting around. So we basically barricaded ourselves in the room and didn't sleep a second until the morning, when we noped out of there and went to the airport. I was never so happy to be patted down at airport security in all my life. I am an atheist, but I'm open to the ideas of ghosts. However, I can't explain what happened. Summer of 2017, I'm a 19-year-old male working in Dubrovnik, Croatia as a booker for a tourist company and a bartender/animator for the same company's pub crawl boat party. My employer was paying me and my 3 roommates accommodation, but this cheap guy placed us in a village called Uskople, which was 21.3 kilometers away from Dubrovnik. This village had 6 houses, not including our own, and less than 15 people living there. The biggest issue was that no bus passed there since it was atop a hill, so you needed to hike around downhill to this other village where the bus stop was built. The hike down to the village was 45 minutes, half hour on the road and 15 minutes in the village, and the bus ride to Dubrovnik was another 45 minutes. One night I was working alone and was coming back about 2 a.m. from the boat party, making my way back from the bus stop to our house. I stepped onto the road on the left of the village with the bus stop and turned on my phone flashlight to light the road since there were no streetlights. This was vehicles only, no pedestrian path, and I turned on the flashlight since this area was known for venomous snakes, and I wasn't willing to deal with that. I'm halfway there when all of a sudden I heard a howling behind me, a wolf-like howl. First, there are no wolves in this part of Croatia, and secondly, my father is a vet, and we've had a lot of dogs, mostly German shepherds, so I know what a big dog sounds like. And this dog's voice was deep. I slowly turn around and find this massive dog staring at me, roughly 20 meters away, growling, barking and howling, but not moving a muscle. I followed his example and stood there for half a minute, just analyzing the dog. I had never seen this breed of dog. It must have been twice the size of a German shepherd, let's say as large as a Great Dane, but its head was definitely more similar to a Doberman or Belgian shepherd. Also, it was completely black. There was something completely off about this dog. I'm not gonna say it had an evil aura, since I don't believe in that sort of thing. But I simply had the feeling that this was something of a demonic dog, or something like that. I can't explain it, but for some reason, I felt like the least of my worries should be this dog biting me. Take note, at this point we were standing in the middle of a road, in the middle of the night. There aren't a lot of cars that pass here at this hour, but I wanted to get off the road either way. After staring each other down for about a minute, I slowly, without turning, make my way to the house. After I walked about 100 meters, the dog stopped the growling, turned away and left. I picked up the pace and was just only a few minutes away from home when I heard a growl. This time it was meters away from me. I turned around and the dog was less than 3 meters away. If I had made a single step, I could have reached out and petted him. Once again, this dog was growling, but not attacking me. It did the regular attack mode posture with its tail up, legs widened, ears up and teeth showing. We stared at each other for another minute. The dog didn't move a muscle and neither did I. The beast was as large as me, at least, and weighing at least 60 kilograms, and was definitely as large as a Great Dane. Once again I slowly start making my way home backwards, and the dog doesn't let up. But it doesn't follow me. I made my way home, and the barking and howling stopped as I closed the door behind me. I tell my roommates about it, and they say they'd never heard anything, even though the dog was relentlessly barking and howling just 200 meters away from the house while they were awake with no TV nor radio on in the room. I asked the neighbors about the dog. They said the same thing, and added that no one in the village owns a dog. My roommates and I agreed that we should never let anyone go home alone at night because of this scenario. We went on to investigating the surrounding area and never found anything. The reason this baffles me so much is because the temperature there can reach over 40 Celsius, and that's in the shade. There's no natural drinkable water source, and there are no animals there except for snakes, small lizards, birds, and insects. The dog, even if it were able to stand the heat, could not feed, and that large of a dog must need a lot of food, nor could it find water. There was no way that dog could survive in the wild, and there wasn't anyone nearby or in the next village who owned a large dog. The neighbor was kind enough to ask around, you see. The dog seemed to have come from nowhere, and we never have heard from it again, which is probably for the best. Because of my general interest in horror, and because they were appealing to me for a while, I collected dolls. It didn't matter what type. I had some porcelain ones, some pretty-looking horror movie-level dolls, that sort of stuff. They were generally creepy to the majority of people, and of course, they're haunted, was a joke that I often had. But I never had an issue with any of them. In fact, I thought they were all comforting. They all had names, and I had a history of picking them out, usually from antique shops, but I had 2 or 3 from a house sale after the owner passed away. On October 28, 2017, my parents were out of town, so my brother and I were home alone, and my dad sent me a picture of the coolest doll they found at this church thrift shop. The doll was the epitome of everything I liked. I loved clowns and circuses, and the soft pastel colors were my absolute favorite. so much so that I was writing a story at the time that reflected these interests. The doll was perfect. It felt like it was for me, like in that Coraline sort of way, but instead of looking like me, it was just something no one else could have wanted. In all honesty, I don't think my dad would buy it, but lo and behold, when my parents returned, I had a new doll to add to the collection. This was the first doll that I hadn't bought on my own or personally picked out, but I wouldn't expect it to matter. All of this happened, and I found out more things about the doll. One being that my parents bought it and the cashier avoided touching it completely. On top of that, they said, "Oh, you're buying him." Honestly, that wasn't uncommon. I'd been given a doll for free before because it was in such bad shape. One man's trash is another man's treasure. Having some aversion to a creepy doll was nothing new. Another interesting factoid about this was that my father, who is very strongly a factual person and doesn't believe in ghosts even the slightest, said he felt this doll before he saw it. To say the least, my mum wasn't happy he went through with the purchase when she found that out. I remember vividly how excited I was to hold it for the first time. I got no negative feelings from it. This was just a doll. I do remember that one of the first things I noticed was his lack of eyes. I figured it was an old one, and the eyes had fallen out. If anything, it just made me like him more. The creepy clown doll, who I never named, quickly found his spot on my shelf, and all was well. I don't even remember when I started to get a bad feeling. It started minimally, small things like feeling uncomfortable around them, or that I didn't like them facing me when I was laying down at night. I was never uncomfortable with my dolls, and even when I didn't want to admit it, I wanted to be the weird girl who collected creepy dolls, but all of a sudden being around them made me anxious. I can only explain it as a deep vibrating in my chest that was nothing but discomfort to be in my room. I ignored it for the longest time, but being in that room alone was invoking an anxiety in me that I haven't felt before or since. At some point, I started having progressively worse nightmares, a reoccurring theme that they were never far from real life. In fact, they usually took place exactly where I was at the time, whether it be my bed, the couch. They were where those nightmares would be so convincing, you'd be unsure whether you had woken up or not. I recall 2 nightmares in particular. One where I was laying in bed. The room was dark, but not so dark. I couldn't see anything. I was laying on my side facing away from the dolls and towards my closet. The door slowly opened, and there was a really big doll just standing inside of it. Bigger than people-sized. It looked at me, but only its eyes moved, and for a moment, that's all I saw before I awoke. This was my first experience with what I can only identify with sleep paralysis, but I don't know if I was actually unable to move or not, or if I was just too scared of what might happen if I did. Of course, nothing was in my closet. It sounds like a cheesy nightmare for sure, but to me this was terrifying. It made it hard to breathe, and made my stomach ring. The other nightmare was when I was taking a nap on the couch, and in the dream I woke up and went to my room. When I went inside, I looked at the dolls and they were moved. Then I woke up again, and this repeated. Each time the dolls became more and more scattered, laying on the floor or completely broken altogether. Something was moving them. It couldn't have been an accidental nudge before I awoke. It looked like something had angrily shoved them all off the shelf. Eventually I did wake up, and the fear I felt as I slowly went to my room was unlike anything I had felt before. I walked as slowly as I possibly could, as if that was going to help with anything. I was just scared of the possibility that they might have been moved. I knew that if I went in my room and the dolls were out of place, something was really screwed up. I turned on every light I could. I was visibly shaking with fear, but nothing was moved. It almost felt like I was being mocked. The nightmares continued for a while with no attempts to be fixed. If anything, I just made them worse. Staying awake when I definitely shouldn't have been, avoiding getting my REM cycle because, due to my research, I found that's when you had nightmares, which I didn't want. I can't remember any other specific nightmare, but a lot of it was just the fear and anxiety that accompanied being in my room, being near the doll, and how uncomfortable it made me. My dad even said he went in my room to get a pair of headphones, and his hip, which has been broken since I was about 8 or so, was suddenly full of a shooting pain, and when he left the room it stopped. It was those small, strange encounters that made it so out of the ordinary. I would do anything to get away from that room when I could, and I didn't even realize it anymore. It was my subconscious telling me that I needed to fear my own space. It was my own subconscious telling me I wasn't safe there anymore, and I usually tried to listen to it. After New Year's is when I put all the dolls away. The night before I had decided to move all the dolls out of my room. I hadn't focused on the fear of any specific one, so I just moved them all out. That same night, I awoke and moved them back into my room. I don't know why, I just felt like they needed to be back. They couldn't be sitting out there. I just needed to move them back in. Apparently that morning I had been acting strangely, and eventually my mum and I moved the dolls into a box and into the attic, after I broke down explaining to her how scared I had been feeling about those dolls lately. My mum is a very spiritual person, so she was open to helping me put the dolls away. I haven't had an issue since, but I did do some more research on the doll a few months ago. For a while, I didn't like talking about them or even thinking about them, so I hadn't even looked at pictures of them. These were all things I found out quite a while later. A few things. For one, I finally looked back on all of this, and the one doll that did have eyes. In the picture my father sent me, which I needed to scroll through 2 years of messages to find, that doll, he had an eye. Of course, it could have fallen out during the drive. I didn't doubt the possibility, but I didn't push the doll's eye out. They were gone as soon as I had him the first time. Maybe it's a coincidence, or I'm thinking about it too much. On top of that, I couldn't find any other dolls that quite looked like it. My girlfriend and I found a few online that looked similar, but they were never an exact match. The colors were all wrong, the face shape wasn't quite the same, and I still haven't found any that do resemble the doll. I even tried reaching out to the manufacturers that created dolls that I thought looked like it the most, and assumed maybe there just weren't many pictures online, but I never got a way of contact. All I know is that it still deeply disturbs me when I think about that doll. My family and I were coming back from spring break in Florida. I was in 8th grade then. Our flight coming home went from Tampa to Houston, then Houston to home. We get to Houston at 10 a.m. on Saturday and have a 3-hour layover. Our flights get cancelled because of a massive storm that affected half the US. Continental's policy is to put passengers from cancelled flights on standby on a different flight. Well, getting 5 people, my family, on the same flight when we all stranded is, as you can imagine, quite difficult. We spent the entire afternoon at the airport. Then, we're about to get on a plane, but the flight was cancelled at the last minute because no pilots could get to the Houston airport at the end of the month, when the pilots have used most of their flight hours. So now we have 2 flights cancelled and are still on standby. My dad gets angry and goes to a manager. The manager gets us an actual seat on a plane that will take us some town in North Carolina, which we can get a plane home from. This flight ends up getting cancelled around 9 p.m. on Saturday. Now my mum is angry too. She talks to a desk attendant and got belligerent. They almost had to call the TSA on her because she was getting too upset. My dad ends up telling the attendant that he doesn't care where we have to go to get home, we just want to leave Houston. This apparently meant a flight to Seattle, the opposite side of the country from our home, and my dad flips out at this obvious stupidity. So we're still on standby for a red-eye flight home. It turns out there are 3 seats open, 1 for my dad and 2 for my 2 younger sisters. They go down the walkway only to have the flight attendant tell them the flight is full, and we end up spending the night at the airport. At 10 a.m. we finally got a flight home. It was the same flight we were originally scheduled for except a day later. All in all, we spent 27 hours in the Houston airport, not knowing if we would even get a flight in time to make it home for school to start back up. For our troubles, we received a whopping $40, for 5 people mind you, in Houston airport food vouchers and 2 candy bars per person. My parents have owned a tavern/restaurant for 14 years in my small town. My father is someone who likes to start new projects and is a well-known person in our town. One day he was contracted by the local realtor to offer my father a private showing of a historical hotel that had been up for sale. This hotel had been around for decades and went from hotel to restaurant to bar with little success. Everyone who had owned it before put it back on the market within a year. The bank had the title now, and the realtor told my father, if you don't buy it and fix it up, they plan on ripping it down. A lot of people in the town thought the only person who could save it was my father, so he bought the hotel. My parents kept the downstairs bar and renovated the upstairs for apartments. That is when odd things started to happen. My father would come home almost every night with the camera footage to show my mum and I. The footage always showed an empty pool room with a random floating orb around in the foreground. My father is a believer in the paranormal, whereas my mother is not. So her and I both chalk it up to dust and bugs, although I will agree the way the orb zigzagged around the room was weird. It still seemed like nothing though. A month goes by and my father comes home early on a Saturday from working down at the hotel. He walked into the house, spooked, something my father rarely is, and he detailed about how he was behind the bar checking on receipts from the night before, when he heard footsteps approaching from the hallway entrance. We don't open on Sundays, but if someone my dad knew saw his truck in the parking lot, they would just walk in to see him. So he didn't find the footsteps odd at all. Without looking up from his receipts, he called out, "We aren't open, but give me a second." He heard the footsteps entering the bar room and take 6 more steps towards him before stopping. Taking another second to finish going over last night's shift, he looked up and peers around the woodish support beam, and there's no one there. He said he got out of there so fast, he doesn't even remember locking the door behind him. My mum obviously thinks he's crazy, but I'm freaked. That place had always given me the creeps, but my father confirming my fears made me never step foot in the building again. 2 days ago, my mum had an experience there that sent her out of the door faster than my dad. She was in the bar room before opening hours collecting the shift money from the night before. She wasn't in there for more than 5 minutes before she started to hear the faint sound of music coming from the entrance hallway. She said she ignored it for a while, assuming it was one of the tenants upstairs. After collecting the money, she went to leave and the music started getting louder. She said it sounded like old waltz music, piano-based, and it sounded clear as day. The further she walked down the hall towards the bathroom, the more prominent the noise became. As she stepped in front of the woman's restroom, she said it sounded like someone was in there playing music on their phone. By this time, my mum was sufficiently freaked out and ran out of rational reasoning behind what it could be. Just as she was about to open the door, she said she heard the water turn on and off twice before running out of the building. In the parking lot, she called my dad to come down, certain someone had been in there with her, but when he came down to check it out, no one was there. Now my mum is a believer, and we are both properly terrified of that old creepy hotel. I really hope there's nothing more to share with you about that. Oh, and as an update, the hotel burnt down a week ago. The cause is still undetermined. A number of years ago, me and my boyfriend went on holiday to Mexico. We were looking around the pyramids on one of our tours, and as we're getting back to our hotel, my boyfriend sneaks me off to the side, away from the tour guide, and shows me something he has in his pocket. By his face, he had been itching to tell me for a while. I thought he'd been acting funny, and that's when he pulls out a small rock. I look at it without much interest, and go back to hearing the tour guide, when he pulls me over again and says, "Listen, I got this from the ruins." I give him a puzzled look. "Why would you do that?" I say. "I thought it was really cool, to have a piece of history with us forever. We can put it in our house." I give him a faint smile. I wasn't really sure why he decided to take a random rock home, but I didn't think it was such a terrible thing. Anyway, that night, I had the worst dreams ever. I dreamt that I was seeing my closest friend Abby, with only one arm. She was trying to tell me something, but it was like she was underwater, frantically waving her arm and stump, and I woke up in a cold sweat, and it really freaked me out. I called her up back home, but she was still asleep. Figures. I tried going back to sleep, but there was a deep-rooted sense of fear in my gut, and something was preventing me from sleeping with ease. I tossed and turned, and then my boyfriend poked me in the side. I instantly turned and asked him what was wrong. He said he had a horrible dream that my friend Abby only had one arm. This freaked me out a little. I hadn't said anything out loud. Even when I tried attempting the call, I didn't leave a voicemail or a message of any kind. There was no way he could have known or heard me. I brushed this off as a simple coincidence, but for the next 3 nights I didn't sleep well, and a general feeling of unease overcame me. We had a few days left of the holiday still, and one afternoon, as I was sitting up in my room waiting for room service as I wasn't feeling all that well, did I see a shadow, about half the size of a normal person, dart from our bed to the bathroom. I was reading a book at the time, and I just about crapped myself. I don't move, feeling completely vulnerable. I just stare at the corner where it went towards the bathroom and listen and wait. Minutes pass, and with trepidation, I scoop myself off the bed and look past the corner. There's nothing there, no one to be alarmed about, and I start to get scared. That's when I see the rock my boyfriend took from the ruins. It's just on the glass table in front of the TV. And I wonder, all of this started when he brought the rock. Could it be? I go downstairs to rejoin my boyfriend a little while later and start speaking to him about the rock and asked him what made him want to bring it. He confessed he just thought it was cool and would be something fun to show the lads. I gave him a snort and went to speak with the bartender and get another drink. We started a conversation and I steered it towards culture and history, and then finally towards the ruins. I wanted to be subtle. Then I said that I heard of the people that took objects from ruins like rocks and stuff. His demeanor changed from the happy, pleasant tone we were conversing in prior, and he looked at me and said, "Did you take something from the ruins?" "No," I said, lying through my teeth. "Good. They say that those who take from the sacred sites are haunted by alushes." I asked him what this funny word meant, and he said that in Mexican culture, they are these tiny dwarf-like spirit things that can drag your soul to the ground and kill you if you're not careful, that they are not to be trifled with. I understood them to be somewhere between a ghost and a bogeyman, but I took his warning very heavily, as I had seen something half the size of a man earlier that day. I told my boyfriend later in the evening that I was having misgivings about him having taken the rock, and convinced him that the best thing to do would be to return it. So he begrudgingly agreed, and we took the same tour again, albeit with a different tour company to not be suspicious, and he returned the rock exactly where he found it. I'm happy to say the rest of our vacation was spirit-free, and the feeling of unease lifted. Whether the feeling was in my mind or not is another matter, but I know that I saw that shadow dart from our bed to the bathroom, and it's something I'll never forget. Don't go pilfering sacred sites, people. You never know if you might bring more home with you than you expected. It was a quiet and damp night in Arcata, California. In this small town, not much happened. Low crime rates, everyone knew everyone. If there was a roaring party meant to happen, every team in town knew. And if someone wasn't from there, we could smell it. It was oddly dark tonight, completely devoid of light. My friends and I decided to play on our personal playground this morning, and we've been out here ever since. It looks and feels to be close to midnight. I've always been good at telling time just by looking at the moon. Tonight was a full moon, actually, my favorite of the bunch. "Marie, come on, we're gonna play hide and seek," my best friend yelled from across the field. I didn't even notice that I had been staring at the moon for quite some time now. Well, we had a hill that connected the playground and the woods, and if you went into the woods, you'd soon find yourself in your neighbor's backyard, so the hill created a wall between us and the neighbors. As kids, we made a sort of dare to see who had the guts to jump the wall and into the playground. I, of course, always won. Well, me and Vanessa. Vanessa is my best friend. We're closer than Tom and Jerry, honestly. "Coming," I respond to Vanessa, and our friend Jackson, who's only about a year younger than us, which makes him 8. I take one last glance at the hill, which is the way to climb the wall, but my attention is immediately drawn to something much more peculiar. I see someone's feet climbing the hill, but I can't see their face due to a branch that drapes over the hill. At first, I think nothing of it. People always climbed the hill as a shortcut to get to our neighbors on the other side, but for some reason this wall was different. I couldn't take my eyes off this strange figure. By this time, Vanessa and Jackson noticed my staring and came over to see what I was so intrigued with. Within a blink of an eye, the human feet that were once visible are now paws. Almost on instinct, I push Vanessa and Jackson behind me slowly, backing away towards the entrance to the house. "Guys, run!" We all start sprinting towards the door. I struggle for my keys, but they drop to the ground, and I hear a gasp come from Nessa, and I look up to find a creature staring right at us. I secretly slip the keys to Vanessa while I stand in front of them in a protective stance. He's big. His dew-coated fur is like coal. Drew escaped through his mangy sharp teeth, disappearing into the prickly grass. His eyes, well, they were gazing right at me. It felt like he was taking a piece of my soul, and they were blood red. But to my own surprise, I wasn't afraid. I felt drawn to him, paralyzed almost, like I never wanted to leave the spot I stood in, but my protection for my safety of my friends got the better of me. "You want them? You're gonna have to go through me," I said confidently. He saw the challenge in my eyes. I half expected him to lunge at us, but he never did. He stood there, his crimson orbs never leaving my brown ones. He was drawn to me. I could see it. I could taste it. I felt a tug on my Backstreet Boys shirt, and before I knew it, I was standing facing Vanessa and Jackson in my own home. They looked terrified, to say the least. Everything was in complete silence now. We were safe, but in my mind I was still out there gazing into those eyes. I wanted to see them again, and I turned to look in the window, but it was gone. There was a sting in my heart, a feeling of disappointment and rejection. My friends and I ran upstairs to calm ourselves down. We all got permission from our mums in order for them to sleep over until the morning. The next day, my mum walked Nessa and Jax to their house, and we never spoke of that night again. 10 years later, and I still fall asleep in the cold of night dreaming about those crimson eyes. I've had more than one and my fair share of paranormal experiences and came face to face with multiple weird things since then. I'm now 20 and did some deep research as to what I saw. The only thing that describes my experience to a T is the hellhound. My family is from Hungary. We are currently residing in Brazil, Rio de Janeiro. Here crime is crazy high. I remember that Mike Pondsmith once called Rio the most cyberpunk city in the world because he read about these cases where police were fighting some cartel that used rocket launchers against them. I live in a pretty expensive neighborhood, but I can hear someone shooting, be it pistols, revolver, or rifle, every day. I've been in a war before, and here it's very similar. The police climb up the slums and leave the perished ones on the streets. The cartels burn people alive and so on. That's pretty much a lightweight situation in the city. There are many more aspects which I could touch that aren't pertinent to our story. Even though we dress fairly simply, speak Portuguese with no accent, and don't go walking around, one look at me or my father and you know we're foreigners. So there was this one time, he was driving a company car alone, going to the docks to take a look at some containers with equipment that the company shipped to Brazil because of some big negotiation. When I say father dressed simply, I mean really simply. A short-sleeved shirt, linen pants and shoes, and an old watch that belonged to my grandfather. And that's it. No fancy suits or anything when it wasn't strictly necessary. It just so happened he was driving in a dangerous area. Too many trees and all. He fell for the oldest trick in the book. A boy of 12 or 13 in the middle of the street lying down. No space to turn, so he stopped. That's when 5 thugs came out of the bushes with guns. I sincerely doubt it was a real pistol the way he described them. They looked more like greenhorns in the business than anything else. Everyone was nervous when they came into the car. They looked into the glove compartment and found nothing, and told my father to drive to the bank. They all entered the bank with my father, and made him empty something like 1,000 euros, which is money considering we aren't rich. No idea why the guards didn't do anything, but thinking better, perhaps it was for the best. If that pistol really was a pistol, that would have turned into a standoff with the police, and a hostage situation in Rio usually turns into showdowns. They made him drive to a slum and took the car. Father was lucky, unscathed, other than a bruise that the gun dude made by whipping his head. Moral of the story? Father went to the police and explained the situation. Police have some kind of veneration for foreigners, and he was wounded. The bank refunded the money, and from the 6, as far as I know, they didn't enjoy it for very long. Police got 4 of them, including Pistol Dude and the boy, as they weren't able to scrap the car for parts. They had to burn it. 1 was wounded and apprehended, but passed away like the other 4. He was a minor, as were 2 others of the fallen. Another regular day in Rio, sadly. I used to go out with a girl called Cheryl. Cheryl was a very volatile girl. We met through a dating app, and she seemed nice at first, but on the few dates we went on, I wasn't getting that many sparks from her. She was so loud and obnoxious and rude. She was smoking hot, which is why I put up with it at first. But there was this one time that the waiter bought her a pizza. The pizza itself was half of what she ordered, and I think it was missing one topping. I can't remember what it was, something random and strange like anchovies. And she started screaming at the waiter, telling him he was incompetent and useless, and how dare he get her order wrong. I found this incredibly offensive. But again, I was blinded in my youth and she was hot. I wasn't getting the best vibes from her anymore, and after having a fun time with her, thought maybe it would be best to call it quits, as I knew that our relationship was doomed. So I planned a romantic night in a camp. I thought it would be nice. She liked camping, and she loved the idea. I thought maybe the best thing to do was to bring one tent, have a nice evening together, and then the next morning let her down on the high of a nice date. I realized that was foolish. In any case, she goes along with it, and halfway through the evening of us just chilling and chatting by the campfire, roasting s'mores and whatnot, does she suddenly get a bit jumpy. She looks at me, and as if she can detect what I was planning all along, she goes, "You're not breaking up with me, are you?" "No, babe." I lie. Shit, I think. She's caught on to what I want to do. I wasn't sure if I should just carry on the lie or be straight with her, but I really didn't want this night to go to crap and wanted to follow my original plan. So I say, nah, let's just enjoy the night. She smiles weakly and goes, "Okay." We carry on our chatting and eating, and that's when we run out of beer. She hasn't drunk anywhere near as much as I have, and says, "I'll go get more beer, honey. I think we need a little bit more just to finish this night off and make it perfect." She says it with a little twinkle in her eye, and I, unsure how to receive this, just smile and nod, hand her my car keys, and she says she shouldn't be longer than 20 minutes. I must let you know that where we were camping was not very far in. It was about a 5-minute walk to the car and a 10-minute drive to the local gas station to pick up beer and to come back, so she really shouldn't be that long. I sit and wait, looking through my phone. 10 minutes pass. No worries. 20 minutes pass. No worries. Half hour passes. Okay, maybe there was a queue. An hour passes, and she doesn't come back. So I start ringing her phone and she doesn't answer. I carry on going, both worried that she's hijacked my car and that maybe something's happened to her. I keep calling to nothing. And then, after about 3 hours, this point it's approaching midnight, and I'm about crapping myself, does she send a solitary message. "I don't like the fact that you lied to me. It's over." That was it. That was all she said. I reply saying, "Babe, is everything alright? What's going on?" I wait till about 1 a.m. until she replies, "We're over." That was it. I frantically texted her more and more during the night, but she never responded. Shit. I fell asleep, and when I woke up, my battery on my phone had completely drained, given that I had been calling and messaging her non-stop, and I had foolishly left my portable battery pack and cable in the car. Shit. I was so annoyed. I was completely stranded. Admittedly, not too far from civilization, but stranded nonetheless by this crazy girl. I knew where she lived, so I knew where my car should be, and that wasn't really an issue. It was more getting out of here that what I was worried about. So, I begrudgingly pack up the tent, put everything away, and start hauling it to the end of the campsite. When I get to the parking lot, I realize there's no way I can carry all of this very far, and I start looking around to see if there's anyone who can possibly get me an Uber to my home. I live maybe 25 minutes away, and I have about $15 in my pocket, and even if it's a bit more, I'd hope they wouldn't mind to help a guy out. But there's no one. I start to grow desperate. It's a little walk to the gas station. I know it's going to be about 2 hours. So, I'm willing to take my things. I leave them in a bush and make my way. It took a bit longer than I originally anticipated, and when I finally made it to the gas station attendant wasn't very helpful and offered to call the cops to come and get me. They took an hour to arrive, and when one of them finally arrived, he looked pissed that he had come to pick up some stranger. He was annoyed, said we weren't his taxi service, and thankfully let me use his phone to get an Uber into town. I got to my house and then realized my mistake. My house keys were on my car keys, which Cheryl still had. I then walked an hour to her house, banged on her door, and she wasn't there. I was furious. She'd left me stranded, with nowhere to go, and with no explanation as to why. I waited outside her door for 5 hours straight, and hid behind one of her bins when I saw her pull up in my car, with another guy. When she starts walking with him hand in hand towards her house, I jump out and ask what the hell is going on. She looks at me in a very nonchalant way and says, "Go inside, Dave, I'll be there in a minute," unlocks her house door, and he goes in. I confront her and say that if she doesn't give me my car keys right now and an explanation, I'm calling the cops. She sighs and with a little smile goes, "I'm not stupid. I know you wanted to break up with me. So I had to teach you a lesson. This is what you get for pulling me along and lying to me." In a way, at the time, I felt like she was right. So I just snatched my keys out of her hand, unscrewed her 2 house door keys, threw them at her, and without another word, peeled off back home. I was absolutely livid. That girl absolutely wasted my day and left me stranded. Anything could have happened to me. What a horrible, horrible person. Admittedly, my intentions weren't all that good, trying to give her a nice night before breaking up with her. But even so, I don't feel like I deserved that. In any case, Cheryl, I've moved on now and hope to never meet you again. I used to do contract security at the emergency room entrance of a downtown hospital, the graveyard shift. I would stand at a kiosk right inside the entrance and monitor access. Across from the kiosk were 2 sets of elevators. The first elevator on the right could only go up to the 3rd floor. The 2 floors above us were administrative floors, offices only, no patient areas. So on my shift, floors 2 and 3 were closed for the night. The elevator on the left I had to be especially trained to use. It serviced the same floors as the elevator, with the addition of a helipad on the roof. This is where life flight helicopters would land with life or death patients that had to be rushed to the emergency room. Security would be notified when a life flight was en route, and we'd take the elevator, use our access key, and go to the helipad. On the roof floor, we locked the elevator in the open position, so no one could summon it from another floor. The elevator would remain open and in position until the life flight crew had the patient inside and hit the floor 1 button. Security was not needed to assist the life flight crew. We would take the stairs down as soon as we had the elevator prepped on the helipad. It had been explained to me that the process was important and that people had died on the pad and even during the elevator ride down. I'm not a ghost person. I've never had haunting experiences, but that elevator behaved very oddly. Every night I worked and the right side of the elevator that only serviced the 3 floors would rest on the first floor. Since it served floors that were not used during my shift, it just sat there on the main floor. I was required to check the 2nd and 3rd floors once a night. Whenever I went to the elevators, I never had to wait for the right elevator to get to my floor because it was already there. The left elevator that serviced the helipad and floors 2 and 3 had a mind of its own. All night it would go up and down from floor to floor with no one inside. You could watch the floor indicator for it. It bounced from floor to floor all night, and it would lower to the main floor, open with no one inside, close, and then go to floors 2, 3, or 5, the helipad. All this activity with no one inside it. The custodial crew was done on floors 2 and 3 by 10 p.m. Before my shift even started, there was no one around to use those elevators on my shift. On my nightly checks of the floors, I never saw anyone up there. The lights were even off. Not only that, but the left elevator would go all the way to the helipad by itself. You have to have an access key to even have that option. The other guards had no explanation. The hospital employees obviously didn't want to be seen as believing in a haunted elevator, and would change the subject or brush it off when I asked why the lift was so weird. But I would watch from the security kiosk all night as that thing would go from floor to floor all shift. It would open up on the first floor across from me, and it was always empty. The other elevator that only went to floors 2 or 3 never moved unless another security officer used it. My dad had a sister who I never met. She passed away before I was born. It's a very touchy subject, as you can imagine, within the family. But one time my grandma was getting drunk and brought up this story on her own. I asked my father about it after, and he begrudgingly nodded his head and said that we think it's true, but to not speak of it. The tale goes like this. Apparently, many years ago, my father and his sister were out on the land as they lived on a ranch. They were doing their duties, and his sister chose to stay out a little longer to finish off some work she was doing. She must have been around 17 at the time. My father, a bit younger, went in because he was hungry, and she never returned. After about 2 hours, my dad was thinking it was weird that she hadn't come in yet, so he went out looking for her, and when he found her, she was crying by a tree. The sun had almost set, and it was dark, and he was asking her what was going on. She explained that just as she was finishing trimming some bushes, did she look over to come into the house and put the shears away, when she saw this huge black dog with red eyes. She said the dog easily came up to her chest, and that upon seeing it, she froze in fear. The dog glared at her without a sound for a few more seconds, and just like that, evaporated into a smoky mist. His sister couldn't take it, and she freaked out, ran and hid behind a tree, not knowing what to do and too scared to go home, as that would mean passing where it had disappeared. My dad told her not to worry, that it was probably her imagination, but deep down, he didn't think she could imagine something so vivid that would terrify her so much. He brought her in, and they tried to forget about it. But apparently his sister liked to share, and told my grandmother and my grandfather what she'd seen. My grandfather, being a very stern man, said that it was nonsense, that she obviously imagined it, and to put it at the back of her mind and not give it any more thought. My grandmother, however, was a bit more compassionate, and although she had a hard time believing her that some strange dog appeared out of the mist and then vanished again, she did her best to make her feel better. Not 3 days passed, and again my dad's sister was out on the land doing some yard work. My dad was right next to her. They were chatting and having a good time, when all of a sudden She seizes up. My dad looks at her with a start, and in the distance he sees the very same black dog. She is frozen in fear, and as the dog disappears, she lets out a horrific yell, and then her face contorts in agony. My dad doesn't really know how to describe it, but her eyes nearly rolled to the back of her head and she collapsed. They rushed her to hospital, and they found out that apparently she had an unknown aneurysm in her head, and it had burst, killing her. They don't know if the sight of the black dog was enough to cause it to burst from the stress, or perhaps it was an omen of her life coming to an end. As you can imagine, it took a very heavy toll on the family. My grandfather started drinking again, ended up going to rehab, and never ended up leaving, as he took his own life from the grief. My grandmother is still about, and doesn't often talk about her daughter, but I know she still hurts from it. My father has never let us have a dog, for obvious reasons. We were in my daughter's room going through the whole bedtime routine. My wife sat on the bed brushing my daughter's hair to put it in a braid, while I stood around waiting to tuck her in and say goodnight. While waiting, I commented on a collectible 2010 holiday Barbie doll, still boxed, that was given to my daughter by our neighbor. I was curious to know if she had taken it out of the box, and my wife replied that yes, she did, because dolls are meant to be played with. To that comment, I mentioned to my daughter that both her mother and I had collectible dolls tucked away in our closet, each of them still in boxes and never opened. These were a Bruce Lee action figure and a Jesse the Governor Ventura doll, and a 95th anniversary collectible Raggedy Ann doll. As I said this, my wife quickly corrected me and said no, that it's a Cabbage Patch doll that she owned, and that one of them would tan well. Having just reorganized my closet one day before, I was pretty sure it was a Raggedy Ann doll, but my wife swore up and down that she never owned such a thing. Curiosity got the best of me, and so I pulled the box out of the closet and brought it back to the room to show her. As I held it up, my wife stopped brushing my daughter's hair and slowly shook her head, and, trying not to scare my daughter, mouthed the words, "It's not mine. I've never seen it before," with a very serious look in her eyes. My wife has an incredibly sharp mind and a memory that sometimes terrifies me, so I know she wasn't trying to pull my leg. I asked if it might have been given to her by her sister, but a quick phone call confirmed that her sister had not. She once did, however, give her a collectible Mary Poppins doll, which both of them remembered. So here we are now in our home, a doll for which we have no idea where it came from. I thought I had chills already running down my spine at that point, until I realized the doll was coincidentally the same as Annabelle, the haunted doll, which spawned horror movies and are now kept in the Ed and Lorraine Warren Occult Museum. It's probably nothing, but seriously, we freaked out. My wife does have a Cabbage Patch Kid tucked away in another closet, but it's not this one. Stayovers, the rooms where people stayed more than one night. At the end of the hall, there were 4 rooms tucked into almost a corner. You can't really see the doors to these rooms until you reach the end of the hallway. There's 2 rooms on one side, 2 on the other, and I was grabbing all the supplies I needed to do the stayover when a man came out of one of the 4 rooms and asked how to work the coffee machine. He was about 3 times the size of me, 6'3", 300 pounds, where I'm 5'3" and 125. Didn't seem like a big deal or weird. I'm pretty friendly and outgoing and can make little small talk. I went back to cleaning the other room and minding my business when he comes out to tell me again his room didn't need attending to. I figured I was glad that it was another room I could check off my list. My manager had come down the hall to strip a room that had checked out, and I turned down the hall to go strip another room, when the man came out of his room again. I assumed he had another question about something in the room, so I turned around to speak to him. He asked, "Aren't you scared to do your job?" "Not really, since I rarely have any interaction with guests as a housekeeper," I say. He then went on to say that I was awfully pretty and needed mace or a weapon to protect myself, and I showed him my car keys that I kept in my pocket for that exact reason. The conversation wasn't really off-putting, but when I realized what he was getting at, my body flooded with anxiety. He then said, "I don't think car keys are enough. You're small and could get easily snatched up." And in that moment I went into the room my manager was in across the hall and waited for him to go back into his room before carrying on with my job as normally as possible. That experience really shook me up, and I sat in another room down the hall for a half-hour crying and having an anxiety attack, because I thought this man would try and find me in whichever room I was in and take me. To the man who stayed in room 131, let's not meet. I'm 24. This happened 2 years ago on Memorial Day weekend. After a solid weekend of partying in Las Vegas, 2 of my friends and I, all dudes of the same age, had to endure the horrific drive from Las Vegas to Los Angeles. If you haven't done this drive before, it is typically a 5-hour stint through the desert, but on a busy weekend, it can be extended to 7 to 9 hours, and a hangover from a 3-day binge is always painful. Our other friends that were flying out talked us into staying for the better part of the day to wait out the traffic. We had a buffet and lazed around the pool a bit more, hoping to recover, and decided to leave at 3 p.m. Perfect, we'll be home by 8. We were wrong. 2 accidents and a billion people on the road impeded our progress greatly. It took us 6 hours to get to Barstow, which is typically only the first 2 hours. We filled up with gas and coffee and hit the road again. The stop took an hour due to the mass amount of people passing through the area. Back on the road at 10, more traffic, a wrong turn, and it's now 2:30, and we were passing through Santa Clarita about 45 minutes from our destination. Then we heard a horrific noise. It sounded like a piece of steel ripping like paper then exploding, but I managed to pull the car off the freeway and onto the side street. I called the AA, and they said it should be about half hour. Crap situation, but half hour's not that bad. The neighborhood we were in was alright, multiple gated communities, but the road we were on was desolate, and a bit of an artery between communities. We all napped, and about 15 minutes later I was awoken by a car driving in the opposite direction. It was an SUV, maybe a Toyota 4Runner with 4 people in it. I couldn't tell what they looked like, but they were looking at us. A few minutes after, I get a call from the AA. Apparently when I called, they thought I said Santa Clara, which is 6 hours north in the San Francisco area. It would be another hour before they could reroute someone to us. We go back to sleep, and roughly half hour later that same SUV drives by our side of the road, going much faster this time. As they pass, and they flash lights into our car. I'm not sure if it was to scare us, or to see if anyone was inside as the windows were fogged, but my red flags went up. For safety reasons I always kept a Bowie knife and a miniature bat under my seat. I know it's childish, but it makes me feel safe. So I took the knife and handed my buddy in the passenger seat the bat. He was asleep and didn't understand what was going on, so I briefed him, but he passed out, and it was just me again. A quarter of an hour passes, and the SUV pulls up about 300 feet behind my car, brights on, and I officially begin to freak out. I wake up my 2 friends without them moving their heads, so team creepers can't see. and we begin forming strategies, but we are genuinely scared since we are stranded and outnumbered. The SUV turns off the lights, and I can see them passionately talking about something. So we sit there, freaking the hell out, and look at them, just waiting to see what they're gonna do. And I decide to call the AA again, and they give me an ETA of 15 minutes. The passenger and driver door both open, and two linebacker-sized men get out, hoods up, all in black. The driver leans against the grill of the car and smokes a cigarette, staring at us. The passenger pisses on the sidewalk. I felt like they were playing mind games. Maybe they saw the light from my cell phone. It felt like the passenger was urinating forever. The three of us are just sitting there, stewing in our own fear. The passenger zips up and talks with the driver. The other two doors open, revealing one small person with a beanie pulled low, and another large, hooded man walked out. The four begin to talk and walk casually towards my car. I pull my knife ready. My buddy has his bat, and my other friend pops up his fists like a fighting Irishman. They get close, then stop about halfway. In the distance were the lights of the tow truck. I look back and see them get back in the SUV. As the tow truck operator gets out, we get out and he starts his business, and the SUV speeds off fairly quickly. We didn't get home till 5 a.m. I'm not entirely sure what they were planning. I'm assuming they thought the car was abandoned and wanted to take it, or something more sinister, if they knew that we were in there. My friend in the back seat has long hair, so maybe they thought he was a girl. I'll never know, but that was an intense night. My brother used to live with our aunt for a few years. My youngest cousin, who was a little girl back then, was made to share a room with her older sister, so my brother could use her room. My little cousin's room was filled with dolls of all shapes and sizes, as in the only space in the room without one was the bed and a few steps leading to it. As expected, this creeped out my brother all the time, and he would take his time to reposition them in a way that their backs faced him instead. But without fail, every time he woke up, all the dolls were facing him again. He said there were even 3 or 4 dolls that always ended up sitting beside his head, even if he had put them away in the cabinet or locked them out of the room. At first, we tried brushing it off by saying it couldn't have been our cousins playing a prank on him, until it went on even when he was alone in the house for days. He got so used to it didn't bother him anymore after a few months, as it happened to him until the day he moved out 2 years later. My aunt and cousins said they'd never experienced anything remotely weird in that room, so it was clear they had a preference for my brother. I was 12 years old when this happened. I didn't believe in the paranormal or anything until this night. At the time, I was living with my aunt and her kids in Jacksonville, Florida. There was this huge rainstorm going on outside that night, and at 3 a.m. all the power in the building completely went out. I wasn't afraid of the dark, so I slept in the dark. But I was awoken by the sound of my cousin, who was screaming for me and my sister to wake up and come downstairs. Being the kid I was, I didn't understand why he would be screaming for us like he was, and I was 4 to 5 months older than him. I didn't fear anything, but he always acted tough. My cousin was around 6 foot tall and was screaming like a scared child. It would have made sense if me and my sister were scared, because we both lived in a state we didn't know. I slowly started waking up, aggravated by being awoken by someone screaming downstairs. I could slowly hear the front door open, and knew my cousin was standing in the doorway by how close he was to the stairs. Me and my sister share a room, where our room is close to the stairs that leads to the first floor of the apartment. I rolled over from facing the wall to where I would be facing the closet that has sliding doors to access the clothes. I peek out the window to see it's raining so hard, the world looks grey. I hate the sound of thunder, and I fear seeing lightning, but I love the sound of rain. It always has a way of calming me when I was either stressed or waking from a nightmare. I used to have horrible dreams of being attacked by people with no faces. Not a blank face without eyes or mouth, but the face is completely black with no eyes, no mouth, no nothing, just emptiness. It was always scary to have the dreams that I'd wake up crying. I stare out the window just thinking of how I wished I wasn't there, and glance towards the dresser with the clock showing 3:05 a.m. when something caught my eye. I glanced towards the closet where I saw a black shadow figure standing in the doorway. It stood as tall as the door, and I noticed it had red glowing eyes. I admit I could have imagined it. I do have mental health issues from abuse sustained by family, and PTSD, psychosis, and borderline personality disorder as well as hallucinations. So I could just easily conclude that it was all in my head, and the hallucination episode was making me feel uneasy. But then I realized I couldn't be imagining, because when I imagined, it usually only stayed for a second or two. But this thing persisted and was still standing in the doorway. I was just laying in my bed staring at this creature, just thinking why it was here and what did it want. I was frozen in my place by fear. I tried collecting enough courage to ask what did it want, but before I could raise my hand towards its face where a mouth would be. But like I said, the only thing there were its eyes. This creature was telling me not to speak. Could it read minds? Did it know what I was going to ask? But my mind was set. I wanted to know if I was going to die. Before I could ask this creature, it shook its head, and I relaxed. But not long after, it disappeared. I laid in bed thinking almost on the verge of tears. You could call me weird, but this situation made me sad. I couldn't help but think that Death himself had wanted me, but then probably didn't, because no one wanted me. That's how I felt at the time. I got out of bed after collecting my tears, telling myself who cared who wanted me or not. I'd prove it to everyone I didn't need them. I wiped my tears, woke up my sister, telling her to come on, and that our cousin was scared. After we leave our room, I look back to see if maybe it was behind us, but the room was empty. When I went downstairs, I asked my cousin if he saw anyone in the house, and to my surprise, he just said he didn't like the dark. We went to a neighbor's until our aunt's mum came back home. About 6 a.m. she comes home to find the apartment empty, and find us at a neighbor's. She didn't want me hanging out with them, because she didn't like me making friends. A week later, I was running down the stairs with my little sister behind me, rushing to the bathroom to take a shower and get ready for school. We did this every day, racing to the bathroom to see whoever made it first would get the shower. Out of nowhere, this huge black dog with red eyes jumped out at me, with its huge scary teeth showing an open maw. I fell backward and landed on my butt, causing my sister to stop laughing and ask what was wrong. I asked her if she saw the dog that jumped on me, and she looked puzzled and surprised. She didn't see the dog. How didn't she see it? It was clearly in front of me, and I felt the dog. I touched its fur when it jumped at me. It felt so real. It scared me thinking she didn't see it. She looked at me as if I were losing my mind. My sister got the shower first. She won the game. It was only fair. I couldn't stop thinking about the dog. When I got to school, I rushed to the library before it started to see what the dog was. The searches I could look at said it was a hellhound, a very scary dog, and nothing that you ever want to encounter, and that people say that they are ancient demons that serve as the heralds of death. According to the legends, seeing one leads to a person's end. Sometimes it's said to be once, other times it requires 3 sightings for the curse to take effect and for the victim to fall. These factors make the hellhound a feared symbol worthy of the name bearer of death. After reading the article of the creature, I feared I was going to meet my end. Seeing the death guy, I told myself I didn't want to die anymore. And then the hellhound. Who knows? All that I know is that I'm afraid of black dogs. So a little backstory. My sister of 21 and I were road tripping to the west coast to move there, and we stopped at a hotel for one night to split up a 2-day drive in mid-June. We also brought along her super friendly but intimidating black Brittany/Pitbull mix pup. I should also mention I'm a 17-year-old feminine-looking guy and often get mistaken for a girl due to my figure. Now on to the story. We got to this hotel around 7 p.m, checked in, and got our room on the second floor. Everything was going great, but we were hungry from the trip. Since her back was hurting from the drive, I reluctantly went down about 2 blocks to get some sandwiches. The walk goes fine, there and back, and as soon as I'm back at the building, I'm hungry and ready to eat. Much to my dismay, my sister informs me that she forgot some things in her car and wants me to go fetch them. I take her key, run to the car. It only takes about 5 minutes and I'm back at the hotel again. Now, this hotel is one of those where the walkway to the rooms is an open balcony, for reference, and the elevator is only accessible with a key card. So I walk up to it, and as I do, I see these 2 men, seemingly about to get up to their car, or so I thought. One had his hand on the door, but upon seeing me they both head towards the elevator. I've heard enough of these stories to know where this situation is heading. I decide that if I walk away, that would just invite them to follow me, in a city I've never been to before. So I use my keycard and press the elevator button, and get in, and unsurprisingly they do too. Now what? I think to myself, and suddenly remember that my sister has pepper spray on her lanyard with her keys. I grasp it firmly in my hand and have my finger resting on the top, prepared to spray. Now thankfully our room is a turn to the right, and then a straight shot from the elevator. I get off, and try to let them get off first so they aren't behind me, but they insist I go first. So now I'm fast walking to our room, key card in one hand, pepper spray in the other, ready to slam the door when I get in. I open the door and these dudes are right behind me, about 5 inches away, probably ready to grab. I open the door and say, "Hey, I have this stuff from the car," making sure they heard me loud and clear, and pushing past the dog into the room. I close it, and then they see me looking at my sister, who's on her bed facing the door. They walk past our room to the right, where there is only one other room. I give my sister a look like, "You won't believe these creeps," and lock the door behind me. I think had they not seen my sister and her dog, they most likely would have followed me into the room and done who knows what. My sister also says she saw them walk past our window and look in because our blinds weren't closed all the way. We think we heard them talking to a woman in the hall and heard them say goodbye, so they probably aren't even staying here. Creepy dudes. Let's not meet again. Last night, my sister, who lives 3 hours away from me, had somewhat of an emergency and asked if I could come stay the night with her. I packed my bags right away and headed there at 9 a.m. As I was about an hour away from my apartment, I realized that my car wasn't going to make it. The temperature gauge was rising and I didn't want to risk it overheating in the middle of nowhere. So I turn around, and when I'm about 15 minutes from home, my car overheats. At this point, it's about 11:30 p.m. I pulled off an exit and waited for it to cool down, then got back on the highway, but it did it again. So I pulled off onto the side of the highway. As I'm waiting for it to cool down, I tried to start it again, and it wouldn't start at all. I'm a 23-year-old female, all alone, new to town, and my boyfriend was out of town. So I start to panic a little, because I've read way too many Reddit stories. I managed to calm down and call my stepdad to let him know where I was, and that I was going to call a tow truck. As I was on the phone with him, 2 cars pull off the highway right in front of me, and then one right behind me. At first, I thought they were going to help me, or that they were all traveling together and needed to stop. But it was really weird to me that they all pulled off at the same spot I did, with one pulling behind me, and they all sat in their cars for what felt like forever, but was probably no more than 3 minutes. Then a man got out of one car, the one in front of me, and began to walk towards my car. He came to the passenger side door, stopped for a second, then walked to the car behind me. This whole time I'm describing what he looks like to my dad just in case. He was then in the car for a while, walked back towards my car, and as he was passing my window, hit it with his knuckle, knocking once, and he kept walking. Then he sat there for a while, and then all left at once. I'm realizing as I'm saying this, it doesn't seem that weird, but being alone on the highway with 3 cars pulled off in front of you and behind you is a suffocating feeling, and I really don't understand why he felt the need to knock on my window as he was walking by. I'm not gonna lie, it made me cry a little because it was so bizarre. I'm hoping they just pulled off to talk to each other and I was just overreacting. But please, let's not meet. My mum has had many strange and paranormal encounters in her life, including meeting her own doppelganger as a child. She had many stories to tell me, and I've grown up hearing about them. The flying cups in her bedroom, the vacuum cleaner running by itself when she was a little girl. However, there's one that still baffles me to this day, and I want to know if anyone else has ever seen this creature or knows anything about it. Years ago, before I was born, my mum had been staying at her best friend's house for a while. Her best friend was married, so her husband was also there, but he and my mum barely interacted with each other when she was there. He always kept to himself and still does today, as they're still friends. As my mum put it, she was parked in her friend's driveway waiting for her friend to come out so that they could leave. My mum was alone in the car, fiddling around with some buttons and such, and she glanced in her rearview mirror. What she saw horrified her. In the rearview mirror, she saw a large black dog walking on its hind legs. Now, I'm a very skeptical person of everything, so I asked my mum if it was just a random big old dog standing on its back legs and using the car for support. She insists that no, it was walking like a human did. It did not touch her car, it walked along the sidewalk like a human would. It did not once get on all fours, and that it walked on 2 legs. She swears this, and I can see by the genuine terror in her eyes that she's telling the truth. I asked if she saw the legs. She said as soon as she looked behind her, it had vanished into thin air, gone like a ghost. When she looked around, there wasn't a single dog or person in sight. That's not the scariest part, for me at least. My mum visited her best friend again, not just the house, she hates the house now, a few years ago, and the subject of spirits came up. My mum told her exactly what she told me about the dog or whatever it was walking behind the car in her driveway, because she never told anyone. Her best friend looked at her pale in the face and said, "My husband told me he saw that too. It walked on 2 legs. 2 people saw the exact same creature in the same spot at different times. I've heard legends of dogs and how you can see it so many times as a signal of fate or fortune. But what was that? Have any of you ever seen anything like it? I'm terrified because I passed my driving test recently, and if I see this thing, or anything remotely unnatural in my rearview mirror, I think I'll have a heart attack." When I was younger, my family used to take vacations, being that my cousins and I were a similar age. This happened in 2008 when we went to Universal Studios in Orlando. I am the youngest of 9 cousins, including all my sisters, all of whom are girls, except me. As I said, our ages were close and only ranged from myself at 10 to my eldest cousin at 15. At this age in my life, I remember being particularly paranoid. Whether it had been a scary movie or two, learning about things in school/news, so let's just say my perspective and reactions may have been skewed by this. So my big Italian family was staying at the Hard Rock, wherein there are restaurants, bars, pools and shops. This one night, the parent, probably half in the bag, gave us money to go to the ice cream parlor within the resort. Stay together, they said. I immediately knew the moment I saw him. I still remember his face to this day. He was the spitting image from The Killer in Disturbia, and this ticked me off from the get-go. I remember being online with my cousin, hanging on the end, and I was locked onto this guy. I may be the youngest, but I also hold a responsibility being the only boy. I saw him make an inaudible comment to one of my cousins before ordering his ice cream. Keep in mind this place is packed, a lot going on, kids running around, maps open, distractions everywhere, but my eyes are locked. Next I see him clearly lean back and a little over to take a look at two of my cousin's legs. We're talking 13-year-old girls here. And as I mentioned, the place is packed, the line is long, and people are shoulder to shoulder. And that's when things got crazy. As he was paying with his left hand, his right was sort of hovering over my cousin's butt, but barely touching. With everything going on, they didn't notice a thing. I turned to my sister and told her what was up. 2 heads is better than 1, plus I wanted to make sure I wasn't just seeing things. Her face immediately turned grotesque when he saw what I was talking about. 2 of my cousins having already ordered ice cream, my sister told us that she was getting a call. Talking 15-year-old pre-smartphone era, only for emergency flip phones, so it would really only be our parents, and that we needed to get out the line. Good quick thinking on her part. The 2 who ordered being understandably furious, my cousin sadly walks past all the eager ice cream customers. When I asked my cousin what the man said to her, she said he asked if we were together. For a minute there, and sometimes even to this day, I ponder whether or not I made a scene over nothing, perhaps only because he resembled someone bad in a movie. But his cold, long hard stare at me as I departed the plaza with my cousins, safe, will always chill me to the bone. Back in 2004, I was stationed in Japan with the US military. I flew home to visit my family for Christmas and then flew back to Japan. The problem was my plane leaving to the US got delayed for 3 hours while they resolved an issue with one of the engines. So I ended up missing my connecting flight from Tokyo to my Japanese city. No problem, I thought. I'll hop on the Shinkansen and I'll be home in a few hours. By the time I made it to Tokyo Station though, the last Shinkansen had left. They were closing the station for the night, and I figured I could just chill on a bench until the morning. But they went through the entire station shooing everyone out. They closed the giant metal gate after we were all outside. So now I'm stranded on the streets of Tokyo, a city I'm unfamiliar with in the middle of winter, with nothing to do until 4 AM when the station reopens. I walked to a few nearby hotels, but they told me to get lost in so many words. So I finally gave up, perched myself on a street corner near the train station, and pulled out a book and decided to read to stay awake all night. I wasn't about to sleep on a street corner while carrying a backpack and suitcase in an unfamiliar city. Then, the craziest thing happened. Homeless people appeared out of nowhere. They pulled out brooms and started cleaning up the street. In the course of an hour, all the litter was gone, and the streets were dust and dirt free. They made the place shine, and then a bunch of them pulled out cardboard shelters, folded up behind vending machines and made their beds. 2 of the homeless guys approached the vending machine in front of me. One of them put out a small change purse and retrieved a few coins from it. He bought a can of hot coffee from the vending machine, as Japanese vending machines have both hot and cold drinks, and warmed his hands with it. He'd offered it to his friend as well, who warmed his hands, and then they offered it to me. I politely declined, knowing I would be back to my comfortable life the next day. I would stand a chilly winter night in the streets, and I didn't want to take their only source of heat away. In the early hours of the morning, the homeless folk all folded up their cardboard beds, tucked them away behind the vending machines, and they all wandered off, leaving no visible trace of their existence behind. At 4 a.m., the gate opened, and I rushed to the ticket counter. I bought a ticket for the 9 a.m. Shinkansen and patiently waited on the platform for my train. By noon, I was rolling into my local station. And that's the story of how I got stranded on the streets of Tokyo for the night. When I was between the ages of 7 and 10, I lived in a house in a small town in Missouri. Nothing was abnormal about the house. I mean, normal house settling noises, which would cause me to have nightmares frequently, until this incident that I will begin diving into. The only weird thing that ever happened was our keys going missing. When you walk in the door, there was a giant metal wood stove that we put our keys on. They went missing for weeks. We destroyed the house looking for them, and one day they just reappeared and nobody knew where they came from. Anyway, there was a doll back when I was younger called an Amazing Grace doll. She had holes in her ears so she could hear you and would turn her head where the noise came from and would say, "Mama." Well, I loved this doll. I explicitly remember cleaning my room and propping Grace against the wall so she was sitting up. I lay down on my bed to read when I heard the clicking she would make when her head turned. So I looked up and stared at her and got the normal "Mama" she would say after she heard something. So I tossed my book down and picked her up to make sure she was turned off. She was. I flipped her switch and then flipped it back to off, thinking that it was a normal malfunction. I set her back in a spot and plopped down to continue reading. When I started, she said "Mama" again. So I went and took all her batteries out. I was over it at this point, so I just tossed her on the ground and went back to my spot. She started clicking quicker, and her head was moving back and forth, and she just kept repeating "Mama." I took off. I ran to get my dad, and he saw it and decided that we would burn the little doll. We did, but nothing happened again to my recollection, but my nightmares got worse. And this was when I was still religious, so I would put all my stuffed animals around me in a circle to protect me. I had a turquoise dream catcher and would pray every night for the nightmare to go away. They didn't until we moved. They weren't every day, but definitely several times a week. In 2013, I was homeless and living in the local women's shelter. The exclusive director of the place is a man called Dan. He was shady as hell, with the creepiest, sleaziest aura around him, and a long history of abusive behavior towards the shelter's clients. But that's an entirely different story. Most nights Dan left the shelter by 5 p.m, and he was virtually never to be found on the grounds past 7. But one October night, he was still kicking around at 9. A few of the other ladies and I were sitting outside just chatting when we saw him pull his car out of the back driveway and take off down the street, like his ass was on fire. His back tires spun out in the gravel before getting purchase, and that's how fast he accelerated. And just as his car disappeared, I saw an absolutely enormous black dog or wolf-like creature come leaping through the brick wall where his office was. It took 3 long strides across the front yard, leapt towards the road Dan had taken off down, and vanished into smoke. Everyone was quiet for a moment until I asked if anyone else had just seen that. One of the ladies said, "Yep," and we hurried around to get back inside. I'd never felt so deeply and viscerally unnerved than I did that night. I draped so many blankets over my bunk that it was like a little cave, just trying to feel secure enough to sleep. Fast forward to December, we had a new lady in our room and was staying up past lights out to work on some small Christmas gifts, and while we were working, we were quietly telling ghost stories. I happened to mention what happened in October, and once I'd finished, 2 things happened all at once. the temperature in the room plunged. It was a little chilly back there because Dan was too cheap to turn up the heat, or even turn it on sometimes. But this was cold, like someone had opened the window, and the baby in the room next door, who'd been dead asleep, let out the most blood-curdling shriek I'd ever heard from her, like someone was hurting her, and started screaming and crying so loud she woke up everyone in the woman's shelter. To this day I don't know what exactly I saw, but I've been left with the distinct feeling that it was evil and attached to Dan in some way or another. And it was always a joke that he'd sold his soul to the devil to be as untouchable as he was. This happened at the last house my mother's sister and I were renting in. The house had changed hands every year or so, and it belonged to a renting company rather than a regular landlord, so we didn't have any information about the previous residents of the place. But it was in a decent neighborhood, so we didn't think it necessary to check. About 8 months after moving in, last January, I was playing video games in the office on a Saturday night, at around midnight or so, when I was startled by an aggressively loud banging on the front door. The rapping was so hard it sounded like the door would fly off at its hinges, and it echoed through the entire house, loud enough that my mother could hear it in her room with the door closed and with music on. Now, we all know that it's never a good thing when someone bangs on your door that hard in the middle of the night, but that didn't stop my mother from racing downstairs and beating me to the door to see what the hell was happening, and answered it by pulling the blinds from the windows next to the door, revealing a man who looked to be in his mid-20s standing very close to it. When she asked him what was going on, he replied he was looking for someone named Jamal. Nobody knew a guy with that name, so she told them nobody was there. The guy kept persisting, and my mother continued to insist that the person they were looking for didn't live here. After a few minutes, my mother would later tell me that there was another guy who appeared from the left coming around from the side of the house, where some windows were, and it became very clear he was checking for Jamal, in case my mother was lying or something. Thankfully, they eventually left. The next morning, I took out our car to drive to work, and noticed it wasn't driving right, as I was sliding all around the lane. I didn't pay it too much mind, however, because it snowed a few days prior and there was still ice on the road in some places, so I assumed there was a lot of black ice. It wasn't until someone in the parking lot of the store I worked at flagged me down and told me 2 of my tires were losing air and flattening out. I carefully drove back home and told my mother what happened with the tires, and it finally clicked. The angry knocking at midnight, the aggressive demanding for a guy we didn't know, the guy scouting around the side of the house, likely looking in windows. They slashed all our tires, which meant they were likely armed. The thought of them not believing us and breaking in still haunts me to this day, because we wouldn't have had a way to fight back if they chose to keep looking. It's the first time I've ever felt completely helpless. A few weeks later, we got a package for someone who was a previous tenant, and a guy came looking for it, after assuming it was delivered to their old residence. Turns out, the guy was Jamal's older brother. We told him what happened, and he seemed completely blindsided by the information, as if that was the first time he'd learnt that his little brother may be involved in the wrong crowd. I don't know what happened afterwards, but hopefully the revelation led to Jamal getting help. We also got some free tires out the deal, so it wasn't a total loss, but I'd rather not see those 2 guys ever again, especially in the middle of the night. I am a collector of vintage and antique items, including mid-century fashion dolls. I usually purchase them from thrift stores, estate sales, or very occasionally on Craigslist. Recently, I purchased a group of 1960s Barbie dolls that were a real bargain. I know the woman had a great knowledge of vintage dolls since she used to sell them on eBay, so she knew what they were worth. Still, I didn't question why she was selling them at such a low price. I was delighted with said purchase and couldn't wait to fix them up for my collection. A few days later, my bedroom suddenly became infested with flies. It was absolutely insane how many of these dirty little beasts filled my room. They seemed bent on driving me mad, as they were constantly buzzing in my face or landing on or over me. Some folks say that flies are a bad omen that signify the coming of bad times. These flies were of plague-like proportions, and were also a true enigma of why they arrived when they did. Around the time, I became very ill with flu-like symptoms. The weirdest part of this illness was a strange feeling like my brain was burning. I also experienced severe headaches that included crazy brain fog that felt like torture. It's hard to articulate exactly what the feeling was, but I've never experienced such an odd feeling in my head. It was so intense that ending my life crossed my mind. One last oddity to add to the pile. Usually I'm a very vivid dreamer with dreams that always have the same basic elements. After the purchase, my dreams have become dark and muddled. When I wake up I feel exhausted as if I haven't slept. So why did I equate these mysterious happenings with the recent purchase of the dolls? I know it's not entirely logical, but it's just a strong feeling I have. What should I do? Could an inanimate object be cursed or bring bad luck? Maybe that's why she sold them for so cheap. I just want to add that I do not practice the occult nor believe in ghosts. The reason being is that after my father passed away quite recently, I saw no sign of him. My best friend also ended his own life some years before that, and I felt that if I were ever to experience a spiritual visit, he would have given me some sign. I just want to believe, but I can't. My shifts are from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. This particular weekend we had a whole wedding party staying at the hotel. The night of the wedding was a Saturday, and that's when this whole thing happened. Before my shift started, most of the drunk wedding guests had already retired to their rooms for the night. I saw a few of them as the previous shift was leaving, and they all seemed very friendly and happy. Once I was all alone for the night, I settled in behind the desk to begin my 8 long hours of work. Then the hotel phone rings. I picked it up, and in my best customer service voice said, "Good evening, this is the Strand Hotel." A man began speaking, but I couldn't understand him. It sounded like he was underwater, like the connection was bad. When I could decipher what he was saying, this was our conversation. "I need 10 towels delivered to room 401. "Okay, I can do that for you. It should only take me a few minutes." "My girlfriend isn't here." I was silent because I have absolutely no idea what to say to that. "I want to have some fun with you, baby." Now I'm freaking out. And then he hangs up. I tried multiple times to call my manager, but she never answered. I ended up locking myself in the bathroom and calling my mum. She calmed me down, and I went back behind the desk. I was still super jittery, so when I heard the elevator start to come down, I'll admit, I hid. I crouched behind some boxes and covered my mouth. I heard footsteps, but I couldn't tell where they were coming from or going towards the kitchen area. I stayed back there for about 5 minutes, and when I was about to come out, I heard a man cough. I froze. I heard his footsteps going back to the elevator, and I stayed hidden until he was gone. Now I obviously don't know for sure that the man who called me was him. But would someone come down the elevator in the middle of the night, stand around silently for 5 minutes and then leave? And here's the detail that freaked me out the most. The hotel room 401 that he wanted me to bring 10 towels to, it was unoccupied that night. I'll preface this by saying that I have spent a lot of time with Native Americans, and their culture/history is really important to me. My dad grew up on the border of a reservation in Alaska and was adopted by a family that was Inuit, and I spent a good amount of time with a friend who is Lakota. At the time of this incident, a friend and I were leaving Standing Rock after being there for 6 weeks to drive home to Texas. We, for some reason, decided to go and see Mount Rushmore on our way back, and after being at Standing Rock for so very long, We had a sour taste in our mouths seeing American presidents' faces carved into the mountains that were straight up stolen from natives. So my friend decided that we should go to Wounded Knee. It was only a few hours out of the way home, and it seemed important that we go. Side note, it was about 11 p.m. at this point, but screw it, I was planning on driving straight to Texas, and we should go to pay our respects, especially after Rushmore. Fast forward, GPS takes us straight to the main part of the gravestones and monuments, plus a bunch of descriptive signs. I've never believed in ghosts or spirits or any of that, but as we parked, I was seized with a terrible fear. I couldn't move, refused to get out of the car, struggling not to have a panic attack and get out of there, that kind of fear. My friend gets out of the car and goes to read the memorials, and I sit in the car literally paralyzed with fear and terror. I look out the window and see two giant black dogs with red eyes that look directly at me. All I could feel was this oppressive feeling that was almost a thought that we didn't belong there. And the word leave. We maintained eye contact as I literally started to shake and feel the most horrible feeling and sense of dread I have ever felt. Also, for the record, I'm a really tough lady, so it takes much more to even ruffle me. I lay on the horn, and once again my friend returns to the car, and I tell her that we need to leave now. I don't tell her what's going on. I just type Texas into GPS with shaking hands and start to drive away. Following the instructions, I leave, taking a bunch of turns and roads I didn't remember from the way in. And after around 5 minutes, we end up right back at the exact same place of Wounded Knee that we were at. Right then, feeling legitimate and actual terror, and trying not to lose my mind, I tell my friend what's going on. She happens to be a hippie who believes in stuff like spirits and crystals, and she took me seriously, pulls her phone out, and her GPS did the same thing. All I feel is dread. I cannot get those eyes out of my head, and I decided to trust my hound dog's sense at that point and just drove as far away as I could. My friend insisted we threw off all the jewelry we were wearing, and I drove in clammy terror for at least an hour before I felt okay to even speak. I still don't know exactly what happened, and it still unnerves me. I got goosebumps just remembering this. Rewind this time to the year 2002. I was in a residential nationwide high school, which is in Washington, D.C. And everyone knows that D.C., or any other major city, can be dangerous. I was invited to visit one of my friends' home for spring break. I met with some local students, and they were all cute. They invited me on a night out with them, and one of the boys borrowed his mum's van, wanting to go cruising around Phoenix to show me the sights. I was the only girl in the group of boys. There were 9 of us hunkered down in an old Dodge white van. One of the guys had a brilliant idea of doing drive-by egg throws, so they bought eggs and kept the van door open as they tossed eggs at pedestrians. This wasn't what got us into trouble. After all of our dozen eggs were tossed, we shut the van door and were getting ready to go home. This is when it hit the fan. I was sitting in the back of the van. We were at a red light. Then a silver Honda Accord pulled alongside us, and I saw 2 men in the car. They kept looking at us. Immediately, one of them rolled down the window and actually showed us his firearm, and was saying something that I couldn't understand. The light turned green. The boy driving his mother's white Dodge van tried unsuccessfully to dart ahead or even dodge, and that wasn't happening with 9 school students in a van. We were chased by the silver Honda Accord. We tried slowing down and speeding up, making quick turns, but to no luck. Their Honda Accord was able to keep up easily, and it wasn't helping that the streets were empty. We accidentally ended up cornering ourselves in when we pulled into a water reservoir entrance that had a dead end. The 2 guys came out their Honda, their headlights shining in our eyes, and they had weapons. They each had two, and were using bandanas on their shaved heads. They were surprised how many people came out the van, and even more surprised that we were all deaf and were signing. They realized that we weren't throwing up gang signs at them. Then they said, "My bad," and just left. For once, being deaf saved my life. So dudes in bandanas and Honda Accords that are in Phoenix, Arizona, let's not ever meet. Also, do not throw eggs at people. We were in high school, and stupid. In the bathroom. Walking out with a bat to investigate, only suspecting a break-in, only to find not a single sight of anybody or anything, and the dining ware and table was untouched. The next experience she had was when she was getting ready for bed and heard a noise coming from behind the chair. The doll was sitting in, and say a dark figure with red eyes glaring at her with anger. Anyway, onto my ownership. When I received the thing, I was fully aware that a possessed object may not show signs of any activity from a few hours up to a few months of being relocated. I never experienced anything. I let it sit on a shelf and collect dust, only remembering it physically exiting my house every once in a great while. I would just randomly think about it, and even when I was doing something completely unrelated or busy at the house. A few days ago, I had lit a burn pile in my backyard to get rid of a bunch of branches and logs, when for some reason, I had the idea to grab the doll and burn it to be done with it. I went back to grab it, and as soon as I touched it, my heart began racing, increasing with every step I took towards my back door. I had finally made it outside to the fire, and tossed it back laying on the fire. Within seconds it started smoking. As soon as it did, my heart stopped racing and I got relaxed. 30 seconds later, its hair and clothes were in full flames, and I watched it as it began to look like something out of a horror movie. The eyes melted and sunk into its ceramic head, and it was converted into a charred black soot until nothing but the head, arms and legs were left. I let the fire keep burning until all the wood had been burnt. My main question here is whether or not it was a good idea to burn a possessed object. If it is, I don't know what to think about it. Let me know what you guys think about my decision to set the thing alight. I'm 22, and as my mum was pregnant with me, my grandfather passed away from lung cancer. The only thing he ever got me was this little clown doll that was supposed to hang over my crib. When you pull the clown's leg down, it plays a little music box style song as it winds itself back up. Now I know this already sounds like a cheesy horror story, but let's stick with it. When I was a child, maybe 7 or 8, I used to have the clown hanging from the metal curtain tiebacks in my room, probably because I was too young to have read or watched it. But one night, my mum walked up the stairs and in my room while I was asleep, because the clown was playing its song, but it had its legs pulled down. Apparently it played for about 5 minutes, and I do remember my mum recording it on her old flip phone and showed me that morning. We actually found out later in the day that on that night, my great-grandma had passed away, so my grandfather's mum. My mum is super adamant it was her dad, sending some sort of signal, but I'd be interested to know what you guys think. About 15 years ago, when I was 13 to 14, I went on a road trip with my best friend's family. It was the 2 parents, her brother, around 15 to 16 years old, and the 2 of us girls. One of the hotels had a courtyard with a pool. We went swimming, all of us, and there were a few other people swimming and hanging around the pool, mostly kids swimming and adults on chairs. There was one guy in his 50s, it looked like, who was just sitting there not interacting with anyone. Sunglasses on so we couldn't see where he was looking, and we all assumed he was with a family there. The next day, my friend's parents went on a date and left the three of us kids in the hotel room. We were good and weren't inclined to do anything dumb like wander off, so they weren't too worried. We had a window overlooking the pool, and I looked out, and there was that guy again watching the pool, where some young women were swimming. Later I looked out again and he was still out there watching, but a different family with young kids. It wasn't sunny out, so he wasn't sunbathing, and he didn't have a book or anything. He was just staring, which made me very unsettled. The next evening we all went out to dinner. When we got back, it was dark. This guy was in the parking lot, sunglasses still on, checking the license plates of every car. He checked our license plates as we were walking away from the car. My friend's dad, an imposing army guy, very protective of his family and car, confronted him about it, and the guy said he was a parking lot attendant. We went to the lobby and asked them to clarify what was up with their attendant, and I'll never forget the girl behind the desk saying, "We don't have a parking lot attendant." We left the next day. I lease a horse at a barn in a very rural part of Ohio. I'm close with the owners of the barn and have a key, so oftentimes I'll go to ride later at night after the lessons are done and I've finished my homework. I had a friend with me who was not a rider. She was just coming to hang out at the barn with me. The way the indoor riding arena is set up, there are large garage doors on each side which I had to open for some airflow. As I was tacking up my horse, I saw something dart across the open barn door and the end of the breezeway. I assumed it was a coyote, and the aisle was lit up, and the outside was dark, so it was hard to tell. I mentioned it to my friend, and we walk into the area from the stalls and just start to warm up since my horse is older and it was chilly. The next half hour goes pretty smoothly. It's as I'm dismounting that I see the similar shape from earlier go fling past on the open garage doors. My horse starts nickering nervously and getting shifty, so I take him back to the aisle to untrack. I tell my friend to go close the barn doors for the night. She says she doesn't want to go alone and is freaked out, so she'll wait for me to go with her. I untack and we close the arena doors. We walk back to the aisle to close the last door, and right outside there's just this massive dog. It was shaggy and came up to about my waist. I'm 5'9". Its eyes weren't glowing, but they were reflecting red in the light from the barn. My friend starts grabbing at me and pulling me back, but the dog isn't moving or anything, just staring at us. I know this sounds weird, but I didn't get a bad vibe from it. I come from a superstitious old-world Italian family, so I'd think I'd have known if it had bad intentions. All of a sudden, it turns around and trots back to the tree line. My friend is freaking out, crying and begging for me to call her dad to come pick her up because she didn't want us leaving by ourselves. It has been a month now and I haven't seen the dog since, but honestly the weirdest part of this story is that the other horses in the barn didn't freak out. If you know anything about horses, you'll know they sense danger and freak out if they think their lives are at risk. This whole situation is just super weird to me. A few years ago, I was reading a forum and a woman said she had a haunted photograph. She said that the picture was taken of her and there was a ghost girl beside her that wasn't there when the picture was taken. More importantly, she said that anyone that saw the photo had bad things happen to them. Naturally, I had to see it. She sent me a link. It was as she described. It didn't look scary to me at all, and nothing happened to me. Eventually, I forgot about it. Not long ago, I was looking for something in my messages and came across the link to the photo. I looked at it again and spent probably 2 minutes staring and trying to look at the ghost girl in detail. Then I closed the tab and forgot about it. Not 2 hours later, my stepmom calls me to tell me my dad had a pulmonary embolism. He lived. On his way home, my husband hit a deer and totaled his car. And that night, my daughter got a horrible stomach bug that left us so dehydrated we had to go to the ER. I am never looking at that photo again. "15 years ago, I lived in a town in Indiana. Where we lived was in the country a few miles away from town. There were a few weird things that happened. So first off, I woke up at 3 a.m. and had a strong urge to go to my window when I opened the blinds and saw yellow eyes, and it was as if it were piercing through my soul. I felt instant hopelessness and fear, then turned around and went back to bed. I'm 100% sure I wasn't dreaming when the morning came, and I went to the area I saw the eyes and didn't see any footprints. The following night, I was standing on my porch and suddenly smelt rotting flesh, the worst thing I've ever smelt, and proceeded to hear crunching leaves. To my left, I see a very large black dog walking towards my home. I screamed and ran inside that night, and I heard scratching on the side panels of our home. The following day, I found a large patch of fur, probably 4x4, in the same area where I had seen the large dog, but the fur was white with grey instead of black. I called this thing a dog, but it was dark. I looked at this thing for long enough to determine it wasn't a deer and freaked out and ran. I knew it was tall and on all fours. We lived at that house for another year, and there were still some mornings I would smell the rotting flesh. There have also been weird instances where I've spoken about this and phones will glitch out or the phone line will cut. Maybe I'm reading too much into it, but it was spooky. I didn't even know what I saw until a few months ago. I was drinking with friends and one of them tells me a story and he starts going on about skinwalkers. So, who knows? This happened about 12 years ago, when I was about 11. It was the day after Christmas, and my mum and stepdad and I were sitting in the living room watching TV. It was past 9 p.m, and my little brother had already gone to bed. Now, my brother and I had gotten remote control cars for Christmas, that kind that had rechargeable batteries in both car and remote. As we were watching TV, my car, that had been in the middle of the living room floor, starts making a noise like it's turned on. At this point, all three of us look at it and witness it drive around in circles twice to make a perfect 3-point turn, then park up against the wall. We all kind of just look at each other, and my mum goes to check on my brother, as he was supposed to be in bed. She comes back looking a bit concerned, saying my brother is flat out, and when he sleeps, he really sleeps. There's no faking the bear snores he gives off. So she then asks me and my stepdad whether we were playing a prank. We both deny it. My stepdad even pointing out that the controllers to both cars had been on the side table where my brothers and I left them after playing with them earlier in the evening. My mum proceeds to check both controllers and the cars for batteries. All the batteries were in the charging docks, plugged into the wall, and we had run the batteries out while playing with them earlier. My mum, brother and I had some strange experiences in this house, but this was by far the strangest I have ever experienced personally. I can't think of a logical explanation for this. I've always thought perhaps it was a ghost. This was over 10 years ago, and I still remember it quite vividly. I had just gotten out of an emotionally abusive relationship and was dealing with some pretty heavy depression, a level of which I had never experienced before and was quite hard to crawl out of. The situation back at home wasn't any better, so as a small escape, I would go out for late night walks with my sister. We never wandered too far. The cops never stopped us or asked us what we were doing at 2 and 3 in the morning. It was weird, but we felt safe enough. One evening, we made our way to the local 7-Eleven just a few blocks away. To get to this place, we had to cross a short bridge over an irrigation canal. This canal is known for having bats roosting underneath, and we would see them occasionally fly out to catch insects. We're just chatting about various things. My sister and I make our way to the 7-Eleven to get our drink. Neither of us had a lot of money, so when we were out, we would get the largest drink offered and share it between ourselves. On the walk back home, we were approaching the bridge once more, and I look up and see the shadowed form of a dog. It was huge, much larger than a German Shepherd or Siberian Husky would be. It was moving towards us. The odd thing was, there were no sounds of footfalls or the telltale signs of claws upon cement. I've never seen a spirit before, and since it was approaching a street lamp and still had no reflection of its eyes, my sister directed us to the median that partitioned the different lanes of traffic. There were no cars out. We were the only ones on the street that night, and we moved to the median to continue our walk, since there were sidewalks on only one side of the road, and that's where the dog was. My sister said to leave it be and to not look at it. It won't bother us. I walked several steps, then looked back anyway. The dog was gone, even as we passed it. If it had sprang into a run, I should have heard the animal's footfalls, but there weren't any. I'm not sure what I saw, but it was a little while before we went out again. I work in a hotel, so I'm sitting at the desk and a guy comes down to buy a drink from our market. I do the polite chit-chat while he pays. You know, like good morning, how are you? But he just stares at me and figure maybe it's too early in the morning for him and move on with my day. 10 minutes later, I look up towards our breakfast area and notice this same guy sitting in a chair facing me and intently staring at me. When I meet his gaze, he looks away and I think, okay, maybe he's just zoned out. I keep going with my end of the shift stuff and look up again a few minutes later to see him still staring at me. At this point, I needed to count the drawer anyway, so I scoop my chair over to the drawer that also conveniently happens to be in a spot where he wouldn't be able to see me and start counting. I then look up and notice him staring, but now he's switching seats. He moved into a higher stool that has a direct view of me at the desk, no matter where I go. He isn't even trying to hide or disguise the fact he's staring. While it isn't all bad, or even as bad as some other things I've had to deal with in the past, it's certainly unsettling and really freaked me out. I made it home a while after. When I left the hotel, I sped walked to my car and got in as quickly as I could. When I drove past the door, he was standing by it, just watching me. I just hit the gas and took a different route home. I checked behind me frequently to make sure I wasn't being followed. But to anyone who has never experienced this, let me tell you that it is profoundly uncomfortable and leaves you with a lasting sense of dread. As a kid, I saw a fair share of paranormal activity, but this is one that has left me puzzled. As a child, me and my siblings all shared one room, 2 bunk beds for them and a kid's bed for me, pushed right under the window of our room. I vividly remember waking up one night, probably 5 or 6 years old, to a pitch-black room. As I laid in bed terrified of the dark, I got an overwhelming feeling or compulsion to look out my window. And when I did, I saw a massive black dog standing at the road, directly under the seemingly only streetlight that was working. As I was staring at this dog, it turned its head towards me, and I saw it had red eyes. It stared directly back at me for what felt like forever, before turning to face ahead again. And then the street light flickered and went out, and I could no longer see the glow of his eyes. No more than a minute later, the street light turned, and in place of the dog was now a very tall man around 7 feet tall, all features completely obscured by darkness, aside from one thing: red eyes that looked directly at me for ages before he walked away. As he walked down the road, though, he gradually hunched over more and more until he turned back into the large dog. I've told this story exactly the same for years and years to anyone that listens, but I can't find any information as to what this could be. My dad passed away when I was 11. Every summer we went to a little town which had a porcelain doll museum. I loved going there, hanging out with my dad, and had several dolls myself, but the one I loved the most was one that resembled an Indian girl with 2 braids. I kept it on a shelf that was facing my bed, pushed it to the corner, and I had it for 3 to 4 years. I didn't even touch it, I only admired it. Well, as I mentioned, my father died in December. Fast forward half a year later, it's June, summer holidays, and I'm laying on my bed with my laptop, chatting with my friends at midnight. Both my door and window were open, but it was quiet outside with no wind, and the doll suddenly fell to the floor. I was startled by the noise but confused since it didn't shatter. The shelf was 1.7 meters high, so I turned off the light, covered myself in a blanket, and went to sleep, hoping I could. The next morning, the doll was still on the ground face down. I started to think how it could fall. It was protected from wind, although there was none, and a 40-centimeter empty space in front of it. I got up shaking and slowly approached it. I sat on the floor and picked it up. It was intact, except for one thing. The left braid was cut in half, not torn, cut. I quickly put it away and never touched it again, nor even took a look at it. I still don't really know what happened. I tried to think it was my dad comforting me, but as I grew older, that didn't seem logical. Why would my dad, who loved me the most, try to hurt my favorite doll? I've had something very bizarre and scary happen the other day. My wife and I were taking our dogs out for a run. Call me weird, but one of the most beautiful spots in our town is the cemetery. We take her there once a week to run around in the area. Don't worry, she doesn't go on graves or anything like that, so everything is going good. We get there and let the dog out and go park in the usual spot. She comes running back very fast, and I can tell she seems spooked. Okay, odd, because she always wants to run to every tree and smell it, and normally it's a pain in the ass to get her ready to leave. So we figured we should head out and find a different spot to let her run. On our way out, we see an oddly shaped rock on top of the ridge just outside the cemetery. My wife stopped the car so we could get a better look, but something felt odd. My wife gives out a little whistle to confirm it was nothing, and it lifts its head. She whistles once more, a little louder than the first time, and it turns around and looks at us. This person, or whatever it seemed to be at the moment, just sat there with its head cocked in our direction. The face, no joke, looked like a dog. A big, brown dog with a long snout, yet the dog had arms and looked like it was using a smartphone. This overwhelming sense of fear came over me, and I tell my wife to drive and get out of there fast. I swear on my life, I've seen this with my own eyes. It's crazy the fear you can feel when you see something you simply cannot explain. I plan on going back on my days off and see if I can find some evidence. I don't know what's been happening, but everything has been weird in our home lately. My cousin said it was probably a ghost joking, but it got me thinking. Everything in our refrigerator has been expiring and is full of mold. Nothing was supposed to expire until the end of next year, and yes, our refrigerator temperature is fine. It's 36 Fahrenheit. The dishwasher was full of maggots as well, which almost caused me to vomit. I've been hearing soft footsteps lately in the living room when I'm home alone. The walls are soundproof as well, so it can't be my neighbors. And I have 2 cats, but they're always in my bedroom. Even my cats, for God's sakes, have been hissing and running away from the pantry when I open it. I removed all the bags and food, which caused them to get even more scared. This all started about 2 weeks ago when my mother bought antique dolls at the thrift store, which, yes, I know is a stretch to even think they're haunted, and it might be a coincidence, but I'm not taking any chances. This might all have been something to do with those dolls. I don't really understand why this is happening now. I'm very uncomfortable in my own home. We can't move out. We can't afford anything like that at the moment. I just want to know what is going on. About 2 years ago, my best friend and I were driving home from late night classes. We live in a rural area and take these roads daily. We've had a few strange encounters on these roads, but this one stuck with me. It was pretty dark, and we were going about 40 miles an hour. I never drive faster than that on these roads, because of deer and other wildlife. The road has a few houses, so it wasn't completely wooded. I'm driving alone and see some eyes and a dark figure that resembled a dog. I stop the car to let it cross the road. It runs across the road and at the edge of the bank and stands on its hind legs and runs like a human. My friend and I are scared because of how creepy this was. We tried to register what we saw and decided that it wasn't possibly a dog. It may have been something else. It was too small and skinny to be a bear. All I can conclude is that I saw a skinny canine creature running across the road, then stand on its hind legs and run into the wood.